Hey guys, tonight we're taking a step back, way back, to where the desert sands meet the life-giving Nile, and where some of the most fascinating people in history built their world brick by brick. Imagine yourself standing barefoot on the cool mud at dawn, listening to the rustle of reeds, watching the sun spill gold over the horizon. This is ancient Egypt, not the glossy postcard version, but the living, breathing reality of everyday people. And I've got to warn you, if you tried to actually live a day here with the heat, the bugs, and the questionable medical advice involving crocodile droppings, you probably wouldn't last long. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from tonight. Drop your city and the local time in the comments below, so I can picture you listening as we wander through this desert world together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Nile doesn't just wake up, it performs. Each morning, as the first sliver of sunlight climbs over the desert cliffs, the river seems to stretch, glitter, and breathe. You hear the creak of wooden oars from fishermen already out casting nets, the soft bray of donkeys tethered near mud brick houses, and the faint clang of a pot being filled at the water's edge. The air carries a blend of damp silt, baking bread, and the faint smoke of morning fires. This isn't just scenery, it's the heartbeat of Egyptian life. Without the Nile, there is no Egypt. With it, the land transforms from dust into Eden. You see families heading down with baskets to scoop water, mothers balancing jars on their heads like living sculptures. Children splash barefoot along the shallows, chasing fish with more enthusiasm than skill. And all around, fields stretch out, green with wheat and barley, fed by irrigation ditches carved with patient hands. The rhythm is agricultural, predictable, but also magical. Every year the floods come, depositing rich black silt that turns desert into farmland. Historians still debate just how far back Egyptians learned to predict and harness these cycles. But what's certain is that it gave them something other civilizations envied: stability. But don't get too comfortable with the romantic image. Imagine waking up in a mud brick hut, roof patched with palm fronds where last night's fire still smolders. Your bed was likely a woven mat, scratchy against your skin, with maybe a clay pillow, yes, a literal block of clay propping up your head. Not exactly a memory foam mattress, and as you step outside, you're immediately hit by the buzzing of flies. Lots of them. Egyptians weren't just battling desert heat, they were constantly swatting at insects. Amulets in the shape of fly wings even turned into symbols of persistence and bravery. That's one way to put a positive spin on bug problems. The soundscape of morning isn't just natural, it's human. You hear women grinding grain between heavy stones, the rasp carrying through the village like a heartbeat. You hear men shouting to oxen, coaxing them into the fields. You hear the faint chanting of prayers, because for Egyptians there was no separation between daily work and the divine. Every sunrise wasn't just light, it was the rebirth of Ra, the sun god battling his way across the sky again. Imagine waking up each day and thinking, "We're glad Ra survived the underworld last night or we'd all be toast." That's commitment to cosmic drama, and while the Nile provided, it also demanded. You, standing there as an imaginary time traveler, would notice how much labor fills the air. Fields need plowing, canals need clearing, animals need feeding. There's no day off unless it's a festival, and we'll get to those later. Even children are roped into chores, scaring birds away from crops or fetching water. Life is survival, wrapped in routine. And yet it's this routine that built pyramids, raised temples, and kept the machine of civilization humming for thousands of years. Let's pause on breakfast for a second, because nothing makes you feel alive like what you put in your stomach. Most mornings people ate flatbread, maybe dipped in beer porridge. Yes, beer. Egyptians brewed a thick, cloudy version that doubled as food and hydration. It wasn't exactly craft IPA. It was more like liquid bread with a mild buzz. Children drank it too, since it was safer than river water. Imagine a 6-year-old knocking back a pint before school. Suddenly lunchboxes don't seem so exciting. And speaking of food, the smells drifting through the air would surprise you. Baking bread, sure, but also onions, lots of onions. Egyptians adored them. Workers at Giza were even paid partly in onions, and some thought they had magical protective qualities. Picture biting into one first thing in the morning, not for flavor, but because you believed it might ward off illness. Garlic too, Basically, ancient Egypt probably smelled like a pizza shop without the cheese. As you walk through this imagined morning, your feet sink slightly in the damp earth near the river, then crunch over dry patches leading toward homes. Goats wander freely, chickens cluck underfoot, and dogs nap lazily by doorways. Cats weave between people's legs, not just pets but revered little guardians believed to carry divine protection. If you drop bread, you'd better hope the cat got it before the goat did. What strikes you most isn't just the work or the smells or the animals, it's the sense of connection. Everyone is tied to the Nile's pulse. Floods, planting, harvest all dictate the mood of the village. A high flood meant abundance. A low one meant famine. And nobody was too proud to admit they had no control. The river gave and took as it pleased, like a moody landlord. People responded with ritual, offerings tossed into the current, prayers whispered to Hapi, the god of inundation. Historians still debate whether these rituals were genuine expressions of faith or community-driven insurance policies against chaos. Either way, they kept the Nile at the center of everything. And while the farmers bend in the fields, you can picture nobles in villas just a short distance away, their day starting much differently. But hold that thought. We'll wander into their gardens in the next section. For now, feel the warmth growing in the air, the sweat starting to bead, the flies still buzzing, the bread baking, the river sparkling. This is dawn in Egypt, and you, standing here, realize something funny. Despite all the strangeness, it feels oddly human. Wake up, eat, work, pray, swat bugs. Thousands of years may separate you, but the rhythm is strangely familiar. You shift your gaze from the bustle of the riverbank toward something quieter, grander. The houses of the wealthy, tucked back behind walls of mud brick painted white to reflect the sun. These aren't palaces exactly, but compared to the farmer's hut you just left, they feel like stepping into another world. Imagine high gates opening into lush gardens, where ponds shimmer with lotus flowers, and geese glide lazily across the water. You can almost hear the croak of frogs, the buzz of bees, and the splash of servants hauling buckets to keep the papyrus reeds green. It's like a desert resort, except the sunscreen is still just crocodile dung mixed with oil. Inside, the air feels cooler, shaded by wooden beams and curtains of woven flax. You catch the scent of incense, sharp and resinous, masking the less glamorous odors of humanity. Servants sweep floors, pour cool water from tall red jars, and make sure their masters wake up to something a little more civilized than swarming flies. And as you walk through this imagined home, you realize just how much wealth in Egypt was measured by control of comfort. A full belly, a shaded room, and walls thick enough to block the endless desert wind. These were luxuries. In the corner, a noble stretches lazily on a bed strung with woven cord, head propped on a carved wooden headrest shaped like a crescent. Forget memory foam. This thing looks like a medieval torture device, but surprisingly, many Egyptians swore by them, believing they kept the soul from wandering too far in sleep. Try explaining that to a modern chiropractor. The wardrobe here is also a step up. Where farmers wore simple linen kilts or shifts, the wealthy draped themselves in pleated linen gowns, so sheer they looked almost translucent in the sunlight. Indigo-dyed sashes, turquoise jewelry, collars of faience beads. It's less getting dressed and more walking jewelry display. You catch the glint of gold, not rare here but abundant enough that even everyday objects might be fashioned from it. Historians still debate whether this fashion was more about religious symbolism or sheer flexing. But let's be honest, if you had access to gold earrings the size of pancakes, you'd wear them too. And while the nobles bathe in perfume, you remember the less glamorous truth. Everyone in Egypt sweat, a lot. Deodorant wasn't a thing. Instead, people mixed scented oils and applied them generously, sometimes in the form of wax cones that melted slowly on their wigs, dripping fragrance down their hair as the day wore on. Imagine sitting at a dinner party while your scalp literally oozes perfume. Not exactly a modern shampoo commercial. The garden outside isn't just for show, it's a living pantry. Date palms, fig trees, grapevines climbing trellises. Ducks quack in the pond, ready to be plucked for a feast. Servants pluck flowers not for vases, but for garlands to drape over their masters during festivals. And there, at the edge of the pond, a goose honks loud enough to remind you that, wealth or not, animals had their say in Egyptian mornings too. Meals here are different from the farmer's bread and beer. Nobles might enjoy roasted duck, honey cakes, or figs stuffed with nuts. Wine appears more often, imported from vineyards along the Nile Delta. But even the wealthy couldn't escape the basics. Bread and beer still made up the foundation of every diet. You might get a side of honey to sweeten things, but at the end of the day you were still chewing grain ground by someone else's tired hands. What strikes you is the social choreography. Servants pour wine with heads bowed. Children run barefoot but silent through the halls. Wives oversee weaving or supervise kitchens, while husbands check ledgers or prepare for meetings at court. Everyone has a role, and the roles are as rigid as the stone statues that line the temples. Historians still argue how much freedom nobles truly had. Were they independent landowners, or mostly puppets of pharaoh's bureaucracy? The truth probably sits somewhere in between, like a noble lounging on a cushion, while also stressing over grain taxes. And yet, even here, death lingers in the corners. On the walls, painted scenes show not just parties and harvests, but preparations for the afterlife. Wealth wasn't just about enjoying today. It was about ensuring tomorrow, or more precisely forever. You spot a servant polishing a shabti figurine, one of those little statues meant to serve its master in the afterlife. The irony is hard to miss. In life, the noble commands servants. In death, he still needs a tiny clay army to fetch water and bake bread for eternity. Talk about job security. You pause watching sunlight slant across the painted walls, catching colors still bright after centuries. The figures smile stiffly, frozen mid-harvest, mid-dance, mid-offering. The nobleman of the house finishes a goblet of wine, while outside his workers bend under the sun. The contrast is sharp, but it's also the engine of this entire civilization. Without the farmers, the nobles starve. Without the nobles, the temples go unadorned. Without the pharaoh, the whole system collapses. Each brick in the pyramid of society depends on the one beneath it. And as you step out of the shaded villa, back into the glare of noon, the heat hits you like an oven door opening. The Nile shimmers in the distance, peasants still bent in their fields, while behind you, laughter echoes faintly from a noble's garden. Two worlds side by side, bound together by the river's gift and the pharaoh's command. And you can't help but wonder which life you'd prefer, sweating in the fields with the promise of onions, or lounging in shade while worrying that the pharaoh might call you to account. Either way, you'd probably still be covered in flies. You're still blinking against the sunlight when the scene shifts again, and suddenly the Nile stretches before you, like the spine of Egypt itself. The river isn't just water. It's life calendar, supermarket, and highway, rolled into one shimmering ribbon. You stand on its bank, the breeze cooler here, the smell of wet reeds thick in the air. It feels almost like stepping into an entirely different climate, lush, buzzing, alive. Without the Nile, Egypt wouldn't just be poor, it wouldn't exist. Boats glide past, their sails white against the blue sky. Farmers in simple linen kilts paddle clumsily in little reed skiffs, while sleek wooden barges carry nobles reclining under canopies, shaded from the sun. Some vessels are piled high with grain sacks, others with amphorae of wine or baskets of fish still wriggling. The water slaps against the hulls, and the rhythm feels like a heartbeat. You can almost believe Egypt itself is pulsing to the Nile's current. You glance down and notice the mud, rich and black, clinging to your sandals. That silt is treasure, delivered each year by the river's flood. When the Nile overflows its banks, it leaves behind this fertile layer, turning desert into farmland. Farmers mark their lives by this cycle, praying for just the right flood. Not too little, or the crops will fail. Not too much, or homes will drown. Historians still debate whether the pharaoh's greatest job was leading armies, or simply convincing everyone that he could control the river's mood swings. Honestly, it sounds less like divine power and more like medieval weather forecasting. Chance of apocalypse, 30%. And here's where it gets strange. The ancient Egyptians measured the flood with a tool called the Nilometer, a stairway or column marked with lines that told how high the water rose. Priests read it like a celestial stock ticker, then announced whether grain prices would go up or down. Imagine trusting your grocery bill to a dude in a temple with a ruler and sandals. Yet it worked. For thousands of years, this ritual guided Egypt's survival. Life along the Nile wasn't just about farming. Fishermen cast nets woven from flax, hauling in tilapia and catfish, while hippos wallowed nearby with jaws big enough to swallow a boat. Crocodiles lurked in the reeds, their scaly backs just breaking the surface. You can't help picturing a fisherman humming along, only to realize he's rowing straight into something with teeth the size of daggers. No wonder crocodiles became sacred to Sobek, the god of strength and protection. Worshipping the thing that might eat you is peak survival strategy. On the banks, children splash in the shallows, chasing frogs, while women scrub laundry against smooth stones. Their laughter mixes with the thump of pounding grain and the low chant of a boatman steering his barge. Every sense is alive here: the glitter of sunlight on water, the buzz of dragonflies, the earthy smell of wet clay. If you listen closely, you might even catch the squeak of a water wheel, an early machine raising water into channels. Forget wind farms. This was Egypt's green technology. Trade flows along the river like blood through veins. Copper from Sinai, incense from Punt, cedar wood from Lebanon, all drifting on barges up and down the current. You see merchants tallying goods on clay tablets, scribes hunched over rolls of papyrus to record every sack of barley. Wealth here isn't just measured in gold. It's in access to the river, in how many jars of beer or bundles of papyrus you can move before the floodwaters retreat. Some historians argue that the Nile itself was Egypt's real pharaoh, a ruler no one could dethrone. And standing here, it's hard to disagree, but not everything on the river is tranquil. Picture a noble's funeral barge, sails furled, oars dipping slow and solemn. Painted coffins shimmer with fresh pigments, while mourners wail on the banks, tearing their linen in grief. The river carries life, but it also carries death, ferrying souls toward the West Bank, where the land of the dead begins. Even in mourning, the Nile is at the center, its waters reflecting eternity itself. And then there are the festivals. You hear the beat of drums and smell roasted meat as a flotilla of boats gathers midstream. Priests chant from gilded barges carrying statues of gods, while commoners dance on the banks, tossing flowers into the water. Children squeal with delight as fireworks, yes, Egyptians had primitive versions of pyrotechnics, crackle against the night sky. The Nile isn't just survival. It's celebration, a reminder that joy can ripple through hardship like sunlight on moving water. Still, the river can turn dangerous without warning. Crocodiles lunge, hippos overturn boats, storms whip sails to tatters, and sometimes famine strikes when the flood fails, leaving the banks cracked and fields barren. You picture empty granaries, hollow eyes, and priests muttering explanations about angry gods or cursed stars. Historians still debate whether climate shifts triggered the collapse of Egypt's old kingdom. Imagine ruling for centuries, only to be undone by too many bad flood seasons. It's humbling in a bleak sort of way. You step back from the water's edge, the mud drying on your feet, and take a last look at the river shimmering under the sun. The Nile is a paradox, gentle and brutal, generous and unforgiving, lifeline and executioner. Without it, Egypt is just sand and sky. With it, Egypt becomes the beating heart of an ancient world. And as the sails drift into the distance, you realize you've barely scratched the surface of what this river gave and what it demanded in return. You leave the riverbank behind, but the smell of silt and reed still clings to your clothes as the scene shifts into the villages scattered along the Nile's fertile edge. Imagine rows of small mud brick houses, their walls sun-baked into the color of toasted bread, roofs flat and cluttered with baskets, jars, and maybe the occasional goose strutting around like it owns the place. You step onto one of those dusty lanes and suddenly, you're in the middle of everyday Egyptian life. Not a pharaoh's world, not a temple's grandeur, but the simple rhythm of families trying to make it through another blistering day. Inside one of those houses, the air smells of straw mats, bread dough rising, and smoke from a tiny clay hearth. Women knead flour mixed with barley, their hands sticky with dough as they hum lullabies to restless babies. Children tumble in and out of the doorway, clutching wooden toys. Yes, even 4,000 years ago, kids had spinning tops, dolls, and miniature animals carved from wood. A cat curls in the corner, tail flicking lazily, clearly enjoying its royal status as rodent killer and household deity. You get the feeling that if anyone had invented Instagram back then, the cats would have run it. Step outside again, and you see men coming back from the fields, their skin glistening with sweat, sickles dangling from belts, bundles of papyrus reeds stacked over their shoulders. The flood has retreated, leaving fertile ground to plow, and everyone is busy digging irrigation channels or sowing seeds. The sound of oxen lowing fills the air, mixed with the rasp of wooden plows scratching across the soil. It's not glamorous, but it's survival, and survival has its own rhythm. Historians still debate whether these small farmers were free peasants or bound to estates almost like serfs. Either way, life here didn't leave much time for vacationing in Thebes with a cocktail in hand. And then there's the market, the heartbeat of every village. You wander into a bustling square where stalls creak under baskets of onions, garlic, cucumbers, and dates so sticky sweet they make your fingers itch. Merchants shout, bargaining in loud sing-song voices, while donkeys bray as if offering their own opinions. A fisherman dangles fresh tilapia from a string, while a woman fans away flies from jars of honey. Coins clink, but barter is still king. A sack of grain for a pair of sandals, a clay pot for a bundle of flax. The air is thick with the smell of fish, sweat, and spices, and you realize this place is equal parts shopping mall and gossip hub. Of course, gossip is currency too. A neighbor whispers that someone's cow won't give milk because the woman next door muttered strange prayers. Another points at a cracked roof beam and insists it's an omen. You realize quickly that medieval Twitter has nothing on a group of Egyptian villagers swapping rumors. And let's be honest, half the arguments probably boiled down to whose goat ate whose barley. Life here isn't only toil, though. Evenings bring rest. Families gather on rooftops under a cooling breeze, chewing bread dipped in beer. Yes, beer was basically liquid bread, laughing and telling stories under the stars. You can almost hear the crunch of roasted chickpeas and the low hum of a reed flute. Children fall asleep sprawled on mats, while elders swap tales of gods, kings, and half-remembered floods. There's no Netflix queue, but honestly, with a sky so crowded with stars, who needs it? Now here's a little odd fact that sneaks up on you. Many villagers kept little clay figurines of hippos, crocodiles, or frogs inside their homes, not as decorations, but as charms of protection. The same animals that terrified them outside were welcomed as symbols of fertility or divine guardians. Picture having a hippo crush your neighbor's canoe in the morning, then placing a tiny blue faience hippo on your shelf at night and praying for good health. Historians still argue whether this was superstition, religion, or just insurance policy in miniature. And yet, beneath the normalcy, you sense how precarious life could be. A failed flood meant empty markets. A sudden fever could empty a household. War or raiders from the desert might sweep through without warning. Every day was balanced between joy and danger, laughter and loss. That tension seeps into the rhythm of the village. You feel it in the way mothers tighten their grip on children, or the way men glance at the river, judging whether it will bless them this year or betray them. Still, there's resilience here. These people knew how to make beauty out of necessity. Reed baskets woven so tightly they hold water. Mud brick homes rebuilt year after each flood, like stubborn little fortresses. Songs rising from threshing floors, prayers scrawled in quick hieratic on scraps of pottery. The village isn't grand, but it hums with life, stubborn, persistent, and deeply human. As you walk down the dusty lane once more, the smell of bread cooling on a shelf mixes with the sharp scent of fish from the market. Cats weave between your feet. A child giggles, chasing a hoop made from reeds. Somewhere a flute plays soft against the night breeze. For all the grandeur of pharaohs and pyramids, this little snapshot of daily survival might be the truest heart of Egypt. You drift further down the Nile in your imagination, following the rhythm of the oars and the creak of wooden boats, until the skyline changes. Gone are the flat-roofed homes of the village. Ahead rise towering columns, painted bright as if the gods themselves had handed down the palette. Temples, vast, carved, and humming with ritual, dominate the landscape now, their gateways wide enough to make you feel like an ant scuttling at the feet of eternity. Step through one of those gates, and you're instantly swallowed by shadow. The air is cooler here, thick with the smell of incense and resin. The columns soar upward, painted in stripes of indigo, russet, and saffron, their tops carved like lotus blossoms reaching toward the heavens. You hear chants echoing against the stone, low voices weaving in rhythm with the clink of bronze cymbals. A line of priests passes by, shaved heads gleaming, linen robes crisp and white carrying trays of bread, wine, and roasted geese as offerings. Their faces are unreadable, the way faces get when they've practiced solemnity for a lifetime. But here's the curious part. Temples weren't just for worship. They were the beating heart of administration. You glance into a side chamber and see scribes hunched over papyrus scrolls, tallying grain harvests, recording taxes, even cataloging fish counts from the Nile. Temples were banks. Libraries, hospitals, and government offices all rolled into one. Imagine your local DMV but with more incense, gold, and crocodile gods glaring down from the walls. Historians still debate whether ordinary villagers understood this political weight or simply came to pray and left the accounting to the men in white linen. You wander deeper and find a priest, pouring cool water over a statue of Horus, the falcon-headed god, washing the deity like a beloved child before clothing him in fresh linen. The statue doesn't move, but the ritual makes the air feel charged, as if the god is quietly watching through stone eyes. Children stand at the threshold, clutching their mother's skirts, peeking in with wide-eyed awe. You can almost hear one whisper, "Do you think he blinked?" And you wouldn't blame the kid. It does look like the kind of statue that might wink at you when the priests aren't looking. Not every god gets the same attention, though. Some shrines are tucked in corners, their walls scratched with graffiti, yes. Ancient Egyptians carved graffiti too, prayers and names etched in crooked letters. The eternal human urge to say, "I was here." You imagine some worker sneaking into the temple at night to carve his sweetheart's name on a pillar, only for archaeologists thousands of years later to nod sagely and declare it evidence of devotional practice. Sure, buddy. Tell yourself that. Then there's the temple courtyard alive with festivals. Picture banners of linen dyed teal and saffron fluttering in the hot breeze. Musicians striking tambourines, women twirling with garlands of flowers. Priests process with statues of gods carried on gilded barks, swaying as though the deities themselves are enjoying the parade. Villagers laugh, children run wild, beer flows in clay jars passed from hand to hand. For a moment, the temple is less solemn shrine and more street party. The divine and the human tangled together in dust, drums, and dance. Here's an odd little fact. Some temples had sacred lakes, man-made pools where priests would bathe before rituals. Imagine strolling past and seeing a row of solemn men in linen, diving like clumsy pelicans into the water, splashing each other before remembering they're supposed to be holy. Historians still argue whether these lakes were symbolic of creation myths or just very fancy baths. But either way, they were central to temple life, and always above everything loomed the painted ceilings, stars spattered across deep indigo backgrounds, constellations marked in gold leaf. You tilt your head back, dizzy under the vision of eternity pressed flat onto stone. The Egyptians believed the heavens were mirrored here, that the gods literally walked within these walls. For you, though, it's just awe, the kind that silences your jokes, even if only for a heartbeat. Yet temples weren't just powerhouses for gods. They were also stage sets for politics. Pharaohs carved their victories on temple walls, ensuring that every visitor would leave convinced of their divine might. You notice scenes of battles, enemies trampled, kings smiting captives with raised clubs. It's propaganda in technicolor, like ancient billboards screaming, "Our leader is awesome, believe it or else." Historians still debate whether these depictions reflected actual events or just wishful thinking carved in stone. Either way, the message worked. As the incense smoke curls around you, you realize temples were less about mystery and more about management. Management of gods, people, politics, and fear. And yet, despite the bureaucracy humming behind every wall, you can't shake the sense of wonder. The drums still echo in your chest, the columns glow faintly with paint that somehow endured centuries. And for a moment, you're small again, a speck beneath the gaze of eternity. When you step back into sunlight, the glare blinds you. The temple shrinks behind you, though its shadow stretches long as if reminding you it's never really gone. The laughter of children and the chatter of merchants fill your ears again, pulling you back into the messy, noisy, very human Egypt beyond the temple gates. The sunlight lingers on your skin as you step away from the temples, but now your ears pick up a different rhythm. Hammering, chiseling, the steady beat of craft. You follow it down a narrow lane where workshops hum with energy. This is Egypt's engine room, where artisans and laborers turn sweat into permanence. Forget pharaohs and priests for a moment. Without these hands, none of the glory would ever stand. The first workshop smells of fresh-cut wood. You see carpenters bending over planks, shaping boats destined for the Nile. Their tools are simple, adzes, saws, chisels, but the work is precise, almost obsessive. One man sands a piece of cedar imported all the way from Lebanon, muttering that local wood just won't do for a noble's coffin. You grin at the irony, sailing halfway across the known world just to ensure someone has a fancy box underground. Priorities, right? Step further in and the air thickens with copper dust and heat. Blacksmiths pump bellows, sparks leap. Molten metal glows in the gloom. They shape sickles, chisels, jewelry, even weapons that may never leave their sheaths. The clang of hammer on anvil reverberates in your bones, like a heartbeat of industry. And tucked into a corner, you spot something unexpected. A delicate copper mirror polished to reflect your face. You imagine some noblewoman tilting it, sighing about wrinkles while outside half the village is still eating lentils. Historians still debate how widespread such luxuries really were, but the artifacts suggest at least some folks spent more time checking their eyeliner than harvesting grain. Then there are the stonecutters. You follow a group trudging toward the quarries, skin bronzed under the desert sun. Their hammers strike limestone blocks, chips flying like pale rain. The sound is endless, a steady percussion against silence. Some men carve hieroglyphs directly into the stone, turning walls into libraries. Others haul massive blocks onto sledges, ropes cutting into their shoulders, sweat soaking their saffron-dyed kilts. You'd probably last 5 minutes before begging for a desk job. And here's the kicker. Some of these laborers were conscripted peasants, others were specialists who passed down skills for generations. Historians still argue whether they were paid fairly or treated like disposable tools, but either way, Egypt's monuments are stitched together with their calluses. Walk through the artisans' village of Deir el-Medina, and you'll glimpse their daily lives. Mud brick houses stand close together, courtyards filled with chatter and children's laughter. The artisans here carve tombs in the Valley of the Kings, their hands shaping eternity itself. Yet their walls are also scratched with doodles, love poems, and even cartoons mocking their bosses. One shows a cat serving a mouse, a playful jab at the idea of power reversed. Turns out even ancient workers loved workplace satire. Who knew the world's first comic strip might have been painted in ochre on a tomb wall? The jeweler's workshop sparkles like a treasure chest cracked open. You see gold melted and hammered into thin sheets, lapis lazuli inlaid into scarabs, carnelian carved into amulets. These aren't just pretty trinkets. They're protective charms thought to shield their wearers from evil spirits. Imagine buying jewelry not just for fashion, but for insurance against demons. Honestly, maybe Pandora should take notes. And in a glassy bead strung into a necklace, you notice flecks of meteorite iron, a reminder that Egyptians sometimes worked with materials literally fallen from the sky. Historians still debate whether they understood the cosmic origin, but to you it's like wearing a star around your neck. Slip into another lane, and the smell of bread and beer takes over. Bakers pound dough, sliding loaves into dome-shaped clay ovens. Brewers stir vats of barley mash, the air rich with yeasty sweetness. Beer wasn't just a treat. It was the daily drink, safer than water and thick enough to count as food. Children drank it too, albeit weaker versions like the ancient equivalent of soda. Picture yourself holding a frothy clay jar, nodding at your neighbor, thinking, well, at least I won't die of thirst, just indigestion. But not all labor was glamorous or creative. At the very bottom of the ladder, field hands bent under the sun, sowing grain or swinging sickles during harvest. Their hands blistered, their backs stooped, their reward often no more than survival. Yet songs accompanied their toil, rhythmic chants that made the work bearable. Some hymns praised the Nile, others mocked overseers. A mix of reverence and rebellion sung between furrows. You catch yourself humming along, even if the words are lost in translation. And then there were slaves, foreign captives dragged from wars, forced into households, temples, or fields. Their lives are harder to trace, their voices faint in the records. Historians still debate how numerous they were, how their roles shifted, and whether they blended eventually into Egyptian society. What you can feel, though, is the imbalance, a society stacked like a pyramid, with comfort perched at the top and raw labor groaning beneath. Yet, for all the hierarchy, craft gave people a strange kind of immortality. A carpenter's box might survive 3,000 years. A mason's chiseling might still be sharp enough to read. A weaver's linen might still cling faintly to a mummy. You glance around and realize it's the artisans, not the kings, who kept Egypt visible through millennia. The pharaohs may have claimed divinity, but without the brushstrokes, hammer marks and fingerprints of laborers, their names would have crumbled into sand. You step out of the workshop district as twilight deepens, the air still buzzing with the memory of chisels and chants. The pyramids may rise in the distance, but you know now whose sweat glued them together. And as night settles, the stars return, bright above a world that never stopped working, never stopped carving, never stopped building itself into memory. The night sky lingers above you, glittering like scattered jewelry, but down in the streets the rhythm shifts again. Instead of hammering and chisels, you catch the soft murmur of voices, the shuffle of bare feet across stone, and the faint jingle of anklets. This is Egypt after hours, not temples or tombs, but the quiet pulse of family life. For all the grandeur of pyramids, most Egyptians lived in mud brick houses clustered along narrow lanes, their daily routines spinning an entirely different story. Step inside one of these homes. The doorway is low, the walls sun-baked clay, and the rooms small but efficient. A central courtyard lets in light, goats nibble at scraps, and a clay oven squats in the corner like a stubborn old uncle who refuses to move. A ladder leans against the wall, leading to a flat roof where laundry flaps in the evening breeze. In summer, families often slept up there, sprawled under the stars, whispering to each other, while stray cats prowled like fuzzy guardians. You imagine trying to sleep with one eye open, half worried the cat might steal your dinner instead. Meals are simple: bread, onions, beans, and the ever-present beer. Sometimes fish from the Nile, sometimes a few figs if the harvest was kind. Meat was rare. Think of it as the Egyptian version of ordering sushi, an occasional splurge unless you were wealthy. And for flavor, garlic, cumin, coriander. Basically, if you've ever eaten falafel, you'd feel right at home. The smell lingers on your tongue, sharp and earthy, and you realize these people's diets were both humble and hearty. Historians still debate whether the Egyptian diet was healthier than ours. On one hand, fewer processed snacks. On the other, a shocking amount of bread and beer that could make even a marathon runner feel sluggish. Family life is noisy but warm. Children chase each other through the alleys, their laughter bouncing against mud brick walls. Mothers grind grain, the rhythmic scrape of stone on stone almost meditative. Fathers return from fields or workshops, dropping their tools with weary relief, swapping gossip with neighbors. And woven into all of it is affection, parents doting on children, wives teasing husbands, even pets getting their share of love. Cats curl in doorways, dogs guard thresholds, and monkeys, yes, monkeys, sometimes perch on rafters like misbehaving toddlers. The Egyptians adored their animals, and if you think cat memes are a modern invention, just wait until you see how many statues, amulets, and tomb paintings celebrated feline charm. The walls are decorated with simple paint, lotus flowers, birds, sometimes protective symbols like the Eye of Horus. Beds are little more than wooden frames with woven mats, headrests shaped like half-moons of stone or wood. Try using one, and you'll quickly appreciate the invention of pillows. Honestly, your chiropractor would have a field day here. But for the Egyptians, these details weren't discomfort. They were normal, part of a rhythm that kept life flowing. Clothing adds color to the picture. Men wear linen kilts, women drape themselves in long sheaths, sometimes with beads or jewelry to catch the sunlight. Children often run around naked in the heat, which is probably why parents spent half their time chasing them with jars of oil to protect their skin. And speaking of oil, cosmetics were everywhere. Both men and women used eyeliner, coal made from galena or malachite, not only to look fabulous but also to reduce glare from the sun and ward off infection. Imagine your boss at the office tomorrow in smoky green eyeliner, insisting it's for health reasons. You'd laugh, but the Egyptians were dead serious. Historians still debate whether the medicinal benefits were real or exaggerated, but the style itself. Iconic music fills the evenings. Harps, flutes, sistrums, the soft metallic rattle of these sacred instruments drifting from temples into homes. Dancers move with grace, their arms weaving patterns in the air, their jewelry flashing in torchlight. Children clap along, neighbors gather at doorways, and suddenly the whole lane feels like a block party 2,000 years early. Except instead of speakers and DJ booths, you've got reed flutes and drums carved from clay. And the songs? Some are hymns to gods, others are love songs, shockingly direct for their time. One fragment of a poem translates roughly to, "Your love intoxicates me more than beer." That's both romantic and practical, considering beer was the gold standard of comparison. But it wasn't always laughter. Night could also mean fear, of sickness, of crime, of spirits wandering in the dark. Amulets hung from doorways, charms were whispered over cribs, and neighbors watched one another closely. A cough in the night wasn't just an annoyance. It was a warning that illness might ripple through the whole block. That's why community mattered so fiercely. Sharing bread, helping with harvest, comforting in grief. Isolation was dangerous, but connection was survival. And through it all you feel how deeply the Egyptians valued balance. They called it ma'at, order, harmony. The sense that life worked when everything stayed in its proper rhythm. Family, work, rest, worship, celebration. It was all about flow, like the Nile itself. Step outside the flow and chaos lurked. Stay within it and you lived not just well but meaningfully. Historians still debate how ordinary people truly understood ma'at, but looking at these small, vivid moments of family life, you sense they embodied it in every gesture, every loaf of bread, every laugh shared under the stars. You step back out into the lane. The night quiet now, only the faint purr of a cat breaking the silence. The houses glow faintly with torchlight. The Nile whispers nearby and the sky stretches vast and calm above. In these moments, you realize Egypt wasn't just about kings or tombs. It was about the ordinary heartbeat of daily life, steady and unbroken, carrying people through centuries. The stars are still sharp above you when dawn begins to nudge at the horizon, a thin streak of pink, bleeding into the black. The Nile glimmers faintly in the early light, and the air shifts, cool and damp before the sun takes over with its merciless heat. You follow the murmur of movement toward the riverbank, where half the city seems to gather like clockwork. This is Egypt's lifeline, its morning routine, its beating heart. Without the Nile, there is no Egypt. You hear it before you see it. The rhythmic slap of water against wooden boats, the low voices of fishermen calling to each other, the distant croak of frogs still clinging to the night. The river smells of silt, wet reeds, and a faint sweetness that lingers in the humid air. Farmers, scribes, priests, everyone orbits around this water, and you feel the magnetic pull of its presence. It's not just a river. Say it's destiny in liquid form. Picture the scene: farmers wade into the shallows with baskets, scooping fish while children shriek and splash nearby. Reed boats glide along, their papyrus hulls creaking, nets dragging behind them. Farther out, larger boats with square sails catch the morning breeze, carrying goods upriver and downriver. Barley, flax, pottery, even live geese tied in bunches like squawking luggage. And towering over all of this in your imagination, the great river god Hapi, belly round, breasts full, a figure both male and female, symbolizing abundance. Egyptians worshipped him with garlands of lotus and hymns that made the river itself feel like a divine guest at breakfast. But the Nile wasn't always generous. Each year it swelled with the inundation, flooding the banks and spreading rich black silt across the fields. Too little water meant famine, too much meant destruction. Farmers watched the river with anxious devotion, waiting for its moods like you might wait for exam results you know you probably failed. The government even employed scribes to measure the flood levels with nilometers, stone staircases carved along the river that let officials mark how high the waters rose. Taxes, grain storage, even survival hinged on those measurements. Imagine your whole livelihood depending on what basically looked like a giant ancient ruler stuck in a river. And here's where it gets delightfully weird. Some villages believed crocodiles carried the secrets of the flood. The god Sobek, a crocodile-headed deity, was both feared and worshipped, his temples filled with mummified crocs wrapped in linen. Picture priests carefully bandaging a reptile, tucking it in like a baby. If that doesn't scream respect to the ecosystem, I don't know what does. Historians still debate whether these rituals were widespread or symbolic, but either way, crocodiles had VIP status along the Nile. Daily life flowed with the river. Women balanced clay jars on their heads, stepping gracefully across the banks, water sloshing only slightly as they moved. Men hauled baskets of reeds, cut into strips to weave mats, sandals, or even boats. Children chased each other through the mud, occasionally falling flat with a splash that earned them sharp scolding. Dogs trotted along the banks, sniffing at fish guts, while cats, ever the opportunists, lurked nearby, eyes sharp for scraps. The rhythm of agriculture was set here too. The fertile silt allowed wheat and barley to thrive, feeding the empire. Flax grew tall, later spun into linen for clothes fine enough to impress the gods. Date palms bent heavy with fruit, and papyrus stalks rose in thick clumps, destined to become scrolls for scribes or sandals for soldiers. Everything from the bread on the table to the ink on the temple walls flowed from this river. No Nile, no civilization, simple as that. But let's not pretend it was always serene. Nile traffic jams were a thing. Imagine boats colliding midstream, farmers yelling at merchants, and the occasional crocodile cruising through the chaos like a living traffic cop. There's even graffiti complaining about ferry delays scratched into walls. So yes, some things haven't changed in thousands of years. You still can't avoid being late because of bad traffic. Festivals often sprang from the river too. During the inundation, celebrations honored Happy and other gods with music, food, and sometimes a little too much beer. People danced along the banks, painted their eyes, and sang hymns that blurred the line between prayer and party. You can almost hear the drums and see the lanterns bobbing against the dark water. Egyptians lived close to their gods, and the Nile was their direct line of communication. And tucked inside this daily life is a quieter truth. Sitting on the bank, watching the sun climb, you feel the simplicity of it. The Nile is more than a highway or a food source. It's a kind of lullaby, a constant rhythm that grounds everyone. In a world of gods, tombs, and cosmic order, the river was the one thing that felt both divine and practical, untouchable yet intimately familiar. Historians still debate whether Egyptians thought of the Nile as a god itself or as a channel for divine will. But walking here with silt sticking to your sandals and the sun warming your face, you realize the distinction doesn't matter much. To live by the Nile was to live in sync with something larger, something that flowed on whether or not you understood it. You stand now at the edge, toes brushing the water, listening to the laughter, the calls, the rustle of reeds in the wind. The river reflects the light like molten gold, and for a moment, you see why ancient Egyptians never separated daily life from the sacred. To them, every ripple carried meaning, every flood a story, every drop a reminder that existence itself was fragile but beautiful. The Nile fades behind you like a steady drumbeat as you follow the path inland, toward the looming presence of something far more human and yet almost godlike, the pharaoh. In this world, kings weren't just rulers. They were walking divinities, avatars of the gods strolling the dusty streets in sandals that probably never touched the mud. To live under a pharaoh was to live beneath the shadow of both absolute power and divine mystery, a combination that could make you feel safe one moment and very nervous the next. You picture the palace, its walls painted white and gleaming in the sun, banners fluttering lazily in the heat. Guards in linen kilts stand at attention, bronze-tipped spears gleaming. Inside, courtiers bustle around, whispering advice or gossip in equal measure. And there, on a throne carved from cedar and inlaid with gold, sits the pharaoh, a figure wrapped in shimmering linen, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, a snake rearing from his brow like it's ready to spit venom at anyone who makes eye contact. You can almost hear the hush that falls when he enters, the way everyone lowers themselves to the ground as though gravity suddenly got heavier. Here's the kicker. Egyptians believed their pharaoh was Horus on earth, the falcon god made flesh. When he died, he became Osiris, ruler of the underworld. So every pharaoh lived in a divine relay race, taking the baton of godhood, sprinting through a rain of building, conquering and taxing, then handing it off to the next. Imagine your boss being not just the CEO, but also the physical manifestation of eternal order. Yeah, no pressure there. The pharaoh wasn't just a figurehead either. He was expected to maintain Ma'at, that perfect balance of justice, truth, and cosmic order. Too much chaos? Too little floodwater? Crops failing? Blame the pharaoh. It was basically the ancient equivalent of blaming your government for the weather. Except here it wasn't just politics. It was sacred duty. Historians still debate how much the pharaoh really believed in his divine role versus how much it was clever propaganda. But either way, the image stuck, painted on temple walls, carved into colossal statues whispered in every prayer. One of the stranger facts about pharaonic rule, they often married their sisters, not just because they wanted to keep the royal bloodline pure, but because they wanted to mimic the gods themselves. Isis and Osiris were siblings after all. To the average villager, this wasn't scandalous. It was sacred theater, played out in the palace halls. To you sitting here with your modern brain, it probably sounds like the world's worst reality show. But in Egypt, it made divine sense. Pharaohs also loved their bling. Gold wasn't just wealth. It was the flesh of the gods. Picture Tutankhamun's mask, shining with lapis lazuli and quartz, a literal face of eternity. When a pharaoh walked through a temple, the shimmer of jewels and gold made him look less like a man and more like a sunbeam wrapped in linen. Priests fanned him, scribes followed him, soldiers guarded him, and everywhere he went, the people shouted hymns as if Beyoncé had just arrived, only with more eyeliner. Daily life under Pharaoh's gaze could feel both protective and suffocating. On the one hand, his armies kept enemies at bay, his officials managed food stores, and his builders raised monuments that made everyone feel part of something eternal. On the other, his tax collectors also had no chill, demanding grain, labor, and loyalty in his name. You didn't just serve the king, you served a god. And you couldn't exactly file a complaint form against a god. But here's a delightful detail. Pharaohs weren't untouchable symbols all the time. Some left graffiti in hidden corners of their own temples. Little doodles and jokes like kids leaving notes in a school desk. Others wrote poetry to their queens, tender verses about love and longing. In those moments, they were less Horus, more human, caught between divine expectation and ordinary emotion. Historians still debate whether these glimpses reflect genuine vulnerability or were polished performances for posterity. Either way, it makes you realize that even gods had bad days. Imagine being a farmer summoned to see the pharaoh. You shuffle nervously into the throne room, the air heavy with incense, and there he sits, larger than life. He doesn't speak much. Why would he? His presence is already a sentence. You bow so low your forehead almost grazes the cool stone floor. Then, with a single gesture, he signals his scribe to note your request, and you leave trembling, half convinced your entire fate just pivoted on whether he liked your posture. Pharaohs also left their mark on the land itself. Colossal statues, temples, and pyramids weren't just architecture. They were propaganda in stone, eternal reminders that divine power had walked here. The Colossi of Memnon, for example, once sang in the morning breeze, their cracks whistling like ghostly voices. Travelers took it as a miracle, proof that the pharaoh still spoke from beyond. Imagine having a statue so big, it developed a natural auto-tune feature. But the most enduring thing about the pharaoh wasn't his wealth or monuments. It was the way he turned everyday survival into cosmic drama. Every loaf of bread, every jug of beer, every flood of the Nile was tied back to his sacred duty. You didn't just live in Egypt, you lived inside his story, whether you wanted to or not. And so you stand at the edge of a palace courtyard in your imagination, sunlight glaring off polished stone, the smell of lotus incense heavy in the air. You see the pharaoh's silhouette against the columns, crown gleaming, and you realize to ancient Egyptians, this wasn't just politics. This was the axis of their world, the living proof that humans could brush shoulders with gods. The palace gates close behind you in your mind, and you wander back into the dust and chatter of the streets where ordinary Egyptians lived. For all the grandeur of pharaohs and temples, most people's days were spent in houses made of mud brick, so soft that if you leaned too hard, you might feel like you were leaving a fingerprint in history. The contrast is almost comical. Inside the palace, gold glitters. Outside, goats bleat, children shout, and someone's clay oven smokes a little too much because they forgot to clear the ash. You picture a narrow lane lined with small houses, whitewashed when possible, each flat roof doubling as a family room under the stars. The air smells of bread baking, onions sizzling, and maybe a whiff of fish if you're unlucky enough to live near a market stall on a hot afternoon. Families lived close, sometimes sharing walls so thin you'd know if your neighbor's cat sneezed. Privacy wasn't exactly the strong suit of mud brick living. Inside, the furniture was simple, a low wooden stool, a reed mat for sleeping, and storage jars stacked like oversized beehives. People slept on woven mattresses stuffed with straw or reeds. No memory foam here. If you wanted comfort, you might stuff in some softer papyrus or lay a linen sheet on top. You'd still wake up with straw poking you in places you'd rather it didn't. Historians still debate whether these homes stayed cool enough during the brutal summers, or if everyone just sweated together in one big, sticky family unit. Daily meals were humble but steady. Bread, beer, onions, beans, and maybe dried fish if fortune smiled. Wheat and barley were staples, though bread sometimes turned gritty because sand blew into the grain during grinding. So if you imagine chomping on Egyptian bread, remember, you're also flossing with quartz. Jars of beer, thick and hearty, acted as both drink and food. The ancient smoothie nobody asked for but everybody needed. Children drank it too, watered down, and no one blinked an eye. Try giving your kid a foamy pint today and see how that goes. For work, Men labored in fields, workshops, or on building projects. Farmers bent beneath the sun, coaxing grain and flax from the soil with tools that looked simple, but worked miracles when paired with the Nile's rhythm. Craftsmen carved stone, shaped pottery, or painted on tomb walls, their hands stained with pigments that outlasted empires. Women's work was no less vital, grinding grain, weaving linen, brewing beer, raising children, and trading in markets. The rhythm was relentless, but carried an odd steadiness, a kind of everyday dignity that anchored the grand myths of temples and pyramids. A lesser-known fact: children in Egypt weren't just miniature adults, they had toys. Dolls carved from wood, balls made of leather, and little animals shaped from clay. Some were even fitted with movable limbs. Picture a child tugging on a toy crocodile with a string, while their mother yells at them to finish grinding grain. That image alone proves humanity hasn't changed nearly as much as we think. Education was mostly reserved for boys destined to become scribes. They sat cross-legged, reed pens in hand, practicing hieroglyphs on shards of limestone. Imagine a homework assignment where every mistake requires chiseling, not just erasing. Girls, meanwhile, often learned trades at home, spinning, weaving, cooking, but there's evidence that some women became doctors, priests, or even scribes. Historians still debate how widespread female literacy was, but the fact that it happened at all sets Egypt apart from many other ancient cultures. Leisure? It wasn't all grinding grain and sweating in fields. Families played board games, especially senet, a mix of chance and strategy that was believed to reflect the journey through the afterlife. Imagine Monopoly, but instead of bankrupting your cousin, you're symbolically navigating the underworld. People also enjoyed music, played on flutes, harps, and drums. Festivals filled the air with dance and song, a kind of mass release valve from the grinding pressures of survival. Clothing was simple, but elegant. Linen tunics and kilts kept bodies cool, with wealthier folks enjoying finer, whiter weaves, while poorer people wore coarser cloth. Children often ran around naked until adolescence, which probably saved parents a fortune on laundry. Jewelry wasn't just for the rich. Even modest families wore faience beads, little blue-green charms thought to protect against evil. Picture a farmer's wife with a necklace glowing like turquoise in the sun, her pride as bright as any queen's. Religious life seeped into every corner of the home. Little household shrines honored protective deities like Bez, the squat lion dwarf god, who looked like the life of the party, but was actually there to ward off evil. Amulets hung on necks, painted eyes guarded doorways, and prayers rose with the smoke of lamps. Faith wasn't reserved for temples. It lived in kitchens, bedrooms, and even children's lullabies. And through it all, gossip carried the same weight it does now. Who watered their crops first? Who stole whose goat? Who had a suspiciously good harvest? Maybe someone whispered that the widow down the lane used herbs too well. Fear and superstition blurred with neighborly chatter. Historians still debate how much such whispers shaped lives. But considering how many records detail disputes, it's safe to say gossip was a force of nature like the Nile, sometimes helpful, sometimes destructive. You walk through the imagined village now, sunlight glaring off dusty walls, sandals crunching on the packed earth. A child darts past clutching a toy bird, laughter sharp in the hot air. Women kneel at grinding stones, rhythmically pounding grain while men patch a roof with fresh reeds. Smoke drifts from an oven carrying the smell of bread. A farmer wipes his brow, muttering about the taxes he owes. Above it all, the distant palace gleams, a reminder that even in these humble lives the gods and kings pressed close. And you realize the miracle of Egypt wasn't just carved into stone or glittering in gold. It was lived in every mud brick, every loaf of bread, every child's laughter carried on the Nile breeze. Ordinary lives stitched together became the fabric that held the civilization upright. Without them, no pharaoh, no pyramid, no temple would have endured. The village air fades behind you, but the gods never do. You step into the rhythm of daily life, and it becomes clear that religion wasn't a separate category for the ancient Egyptians. It was the glue that held everything together. Every breath, every harvest, every meal somehow brushed against the divine. To live without gods in Egypt would be like living without the Nile itself. Picture yourself waking up in a modest mud brick home. Before you even take your first sip of beer-bread breakfast, you glance at a little clay figurine on a shelf. Bez, the squat, cheerful, lion-faced protector. He's ugly enough to be adorable, tongue out, eyes bulging, beard bristling, and that's the point. He wards off evil, especially the kind that sneaks in at night. Your neighbor has Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, carved onto a small amulet dangling near her bed. Everywhere you look, some divine face peers back, reminding you that life and the gods are inseparable. The bigger gods, the ones you know from textbooks, were just as present, even if they lived in towering temples. Ra blazed overhead in the sun, sailing his golden bark across the sky. Osiris waited in the underworld, a patient judge dressed in green flesh and wrapped like a kingly mummy. Isis, the goddess of magic and motherhood, hovered in prayers whispered by mothers stirring porridge for their children. And Anubis, jackal-headed, wasn't just a death god. He was the one you silently asked to keep your loved ones' bodies safe from decay. Everyday life was threaded with these names. You didn't just say, "The sun is hot today." You said, "Ra burns brightly." Festivals were when these gods stepped closest to the people. Imagine the streets packed shoulder to shoulder, drums pounding, incense clouding the air, processions carrying statues of gods out from the temples so ordinary eyes could glimpse them. For one day, the divine wasn't hidden behind sacred walls. Children gawked, elders bowed, and vendors made a killing selling figs and beer. A festival was half spiritual devotion, half carnival atmosphere, with the gods as honored guests. And yet religion wasn't just public spectacle, it was insurance. If your child fell ill, you tied a charm around their neck. If your harvest faltered, you muttered a prayer while scattering seed. If you feared betrayal, you wrote a curse on a pot and smashed it, sending the spell into the earth like a divine text message. Magic and religion blended seamlessly. There was no line between them. Historians still debate whether Egyptians truly believed in magic's power or simply used it as psychological comfort. But either way, it worked its way into every crack of daily life. A fun fact: temples weren't places where the general population gathered to worship. They were the homes of the gods, tended by priests who fed the statues, clothed them, and tucked them into bed at night like royal children. Ordinary Egyptians weren't strolling into Karnak to hang out. They stood outside, hoping the rituals inside carried enough weight to keep the world spinning. That distance might seem odd, but it gave everyday faith a cozy intimacy. Your gods at home cared about your cooking fire, while the big ones in temples kept the sun rising and the Nile flowing. Animals also carried divine weight. Cats weren't just pets. They were living links to Bastet, the feline goddess of grace and protection. Dogs connected to Anubis, while ibises, hawks, crocodiles, and bulls all bore the echoes of divinity. Imagine living in a world where every creature you encountered could be sacred. No pressure when you're shooing a cat off your breadbasket. And then there's the Nile itself. You didn't just see it as water. It was Hapi, the god of inundation, flooding fields with life-giving silt. When the flood came too high, you feared Hapi's anger. When it came too low, you feared neglect. A simple boat ride turned into a communion with forces far larger than yourself. Even the breeze on the river might be read as a god's sigh. Superstition wove through everything. You probably wouldn't step outside without an amulet tucked into your belt or a quick prayer whispered under your breath. Maybe you even traced the Eye of Horus into dust near your door to ward off illness. These small rituals made the uncertain world feel more controllable. Historians still debate whether these practices were expressions of deep belief or just cultural habit, like saying "bless you" when someone sneezes. But either way, they shaped every Egyptian life, and for all the fear of divine wrath, there was also joy. Songs sung to Hathor, the goddess of love and music, promised laughter and fertility. Priests danced in her honor with sistra, rattling instruments shaped like loops of metal that jingled in the sun. You can almost hear it, a chorus of rattles, drums, and voices raised in praise, turning faith into celebration. By nightfall, as the stars rose, you might look skyward and see not random constellations, but Nut, the sky goddess, arching overhead, swallowing the sun only to birth it again at dawn. The Milky Way wasn't just dust and light. It was the goddess's body, luminous and eternal. In that vision, you felt less alone, wrapped not just by the air but by a divine mother stretching across the sky. Religion, in short, wasn't separate from living. It was living. Every shadow, every harvest, every illness, and every laugh was tied back to a god, a prayer, or a superstition. To be Egyptian was to swim in a sea of the divine, where faith wasn't optional. It was as natural as breathing. And as you imagine yourself laying back on a reed mat, the scent of lamp oil faint in the air, you whisper a prayer you don't even fully understand. It drifts upward, blending with millions of others across centuries, weaving into the eternal hum of Egypt's gods. You might think priests in ancient Egypt were like modern clergy, robed, solemn, leading crowds in prayer. But here's the twist. They weren't spiritual guides for the people so much as caretakers for the gods. Their job was less Sunday sermon and more divine butler service. Every temple was a cosmic household, and the statues inside weren't just symbolic. They were treated as living deities who needed food, baths, clothing, and a solid daily routine. Imagine waking at dawn in white linen robes. Purity was the fashion requirement, and no, laundry wasn't optional. You shave your entire body, head to toe, because even a single hair was considered impure in front of the gods. Then you step into the temple, its walls glowing with painted hieroglyphs, torches flickering against towering stone columns. The first task? Wake the god. Yes, literally. You open the sanctuary doors, remove the statue's protective cover, and greet it with hymns. Think of it as a celestial alarm clock, except instead of snoozing, you're bowing deeply while shaking a sistrum. Feeding the god came next. Plates of bread, beer, meat, and fruit were laid before the statue. The funny part? After the offerings sustained the deity, the leftovers went to the priests. It was the original all-you-can-eat buffet, courtesy of the divine pantry. Historians still debate whether people truly believed the gods consumed the food spiritually, or whether the ritual was mostly symbolic. But either way, it was a pretty sweet perk of the job. And then came the daily wardrobe change. The god statue was washed with sacred water, anointed with oils, and dressed in fresh linens. Jewelry was carefully placed, collars, bracelets, maybe even a golden crown. Picture it. Priests fussing over a wooden or stone statue like stagehands preparing an actor for the spotlight. There's even evidence of perfumes being applied. Who knew eternity came with a skincare routine? Temples themselves weren't open community spaces. The average farmer never strolled in to chat with the god. Instead, massive temple courtyards and pylons loomed as public facades, while the deeper you went, the more restricted it became. Ordinary people might stand outside, smelling incense wafting through the gates, while only the high priests entered the inner sanctuary. It was divine VIP access with the strictest guest list imaginable. Still, the temple wasn't entirely cut off from daily life. Processions carried statues of gods through town on festival days, giving everyone a glimpse of divinity. Priests marched with sacred barks, golden shrines carried on shoulders, while musicians played flutes and drums. For that brief moment, the boundary between gods and humans melted, and the crowd surged forward, shouting prayers and tossing garlands. It was both a party and a cosmic recalibration, reminding everyone that the gods still walked among them. Magic played a role too. Priests were keepers of rituals and spells, inscribing them onto papyrus or temple walls. Healing prayers, curse-breaking incantations, protective charms. They managed a spiritual toolbox that made them essential in crises. If your child was sick, you might not step foot inside the temple, but you'd pay a priest to craft a written spell or amulet. Magic and religion weren't rivals. They were partners, different threads in the same fabric. And here's a detail that might surprise you. Priests weren't always full-time. Many had day jobs, scribes, administrators, even farmers, serving shifts in temples like seasonal gigs. Imagine splitting your time between bookkeeping and bathing a god statue. Talk about an odd résumé. Historians still argue whether this system reflected flexibility or control, but it kept temples integrated into society, rather than forming a separate priestly caste. High priests, though, wielded enormous power. In cities like Thebes, the high priest of Amun could rival Pharaoh in influence. Temples owned vast lands, employed thousands of workers, and collected staggering wealth. A temple complex was less a church and more a corporation with spiritual branding. If you lived nearby, odds are you worked for the temple in some capacity, making bread, weaving linens, carving statues, or hauling stone. At night, as torches dimmed, priests sealed the sanctuary, covering the god's statue once more. The idea was that the deity rested, while humans guarded the world outside. You can almost picture the silence. A locked chamber, flickers of oil lamps dying, the weight of stone walls pressing in. Somewhere beyond those walls, villagers laughed, lovers whispered, Dogs barked, but inside the temple it was stillness, as though the heartbeat of the universe paused until morning. And yet, for all the ritual and reverence, priests were still human. Scandals exist in the records: embezzlement of temple goods, fights over positions, even accusations of neglecting rituals. It wasn't all serene chanting and incense clouds. One papyrus hints at a priest getting drunk on temple beer and botching ceremonies. Apparently, even divine service couldn't cure human flaws. The temple system was both awe-inspiring and fragile. It anchored daily life, controlled enormous resources, and connected the people to the gods. But it also concentrated power in a few hands. Historians still debate whether this made Egypt more stable or sowed seeds of corruption. What's clear is that the temples became as essential as the Nile. Without them, Egyptian society would have had no structure for the spiritual anxieties that underpinned everything. So, as you picture yourself leaving the temple courtyard, the air thick with incense and the distant echo of chants, you feel the weight of religion's machinery. Priests kept the gods alive in stone and ritual, but they also kept society tethered to cosmic order. And just when you think you've understood their world, you hear a faint ringing, the steady rhythm of chisels tapping limestone. Because beyond the gods and priests lay something even more enduring: the way Egyptians built monuments that outlasted entire civilizations. The sound of chisels in your imagination sharpens until it's unmistakable. The pulse of stone against stone, the heartbeat of Egypt's monuments. You picture it: the desert sun blazing, sweat glistening on bare shoulders, and a line of workers rhythmically carving blocks that will someday tower higher than the horizon itself. You've seen the pyramids on postcards or Instagram feeds. But here's the funny truth: those snapshots flatten what was once a living construction site, loud, dusty, and full of human drama. Let's start with the obvious: the pyramids. Everyone imagines slaves chained in misery, whipped under merciless overseers. But evidence tells a different story. Most workers were farmers drafted during the Nile's flood season, when fields lay underwater and farming was impossible. They weren't slaves. They were seasonal laborers, organized into crews with pride in their work. Archaeologists even found graffiti carved into blocks boasting of the drunkards of Menkaure and the friends of Khufu. Imagine an ancient construction team giving themselves names like a medieval softball league. Apparently, crew spirit has been around for a long time. Still, the work was brutal. Dragging multi-ton limestone blocks across sledges took raw muscle, clever engineering, and maybe a touch of desperation. The ramps stretched like highways of dirt, sloping up toward the rising pyramid. Workers poured water on sand to reduce friction, a trick that engineers only rediscovered in modern experiments. And yet picture the sound: the grunts, the crunch of sledges, the rhythmic songs to keep everyone pulling in sync. It was labor, but it was also community, the pulse of a civilization beating in unison. And here's a lesser-known fact: the workers ate well. Excavations at Giza show remains of cattle, sheep, and fish, evidence of hearty meals. Far from being starved slaves, they were fueled like athletes. Bread, beer, and meat were daily staples, enough calories to power endless hauling. Historians still debate whether this reflected respect for laborers or sheer necessity. After all, hungry workers don't move stone. Either way, the diet puts modern construction site lunches to shame. The monuments weren't just pyramids, though. Temples stretched across the land, colossal stone complexes that swallowed entire villages during construction. Karnak, with its forest of columns, took centuries of additions. Luxor glowed with colossal statues, obelisks rising like stone sunbeams. Imagine standing at the base of a 300-ton obelisk, watching it inch upright with ropes, pulleys, and sheer manpower. Say it's the kind of stunt that would make modern crane operators sweat bullets. Inside tombs and temples, artisans worked with more delicate tools. Chisels etched hieroglyphs, paintbrushes flicked mineral pigments onto walls, goldsmiths hammered intricate jewelry. If pyramid building was the brawn, this was the finesse. Rooms filled with flickering oil lamps, colors glowing in red ochre, malachite green, and lapis lazuli blue. Painters ground pigments from stones rarer than diamonds, creating hues that still shimmer thousands of years later. Imagine one of them sneezing mid-brushstroke and muttering that no one would notice. It's strangely comforting to think perfection wasn't always the rule. Building wasn't just work. It was ritual. Every temple was aligned with celestial bodies, every stone laid with prayers. When the cornerstone of a temple was set, priests buried offerings beneath, amulets, grains, even miniature tools, to bless the foundation. The monuments weren't just meant to stand tall. They were meant to stand holy, plugged directly into the cosmic order. But monuments had their shadows. The sheer resources consumed, stone, labor, livestock, land, meant that building projects could bleed a kingdom dry. Pharaohs earned glory from their tombs, but their successors often inherited debt. Some monuments even became targets of resentment. Imagine being a farmer watching half your grain tithed to feed workers hauling stones you'd never benefit from. The pride was real, but so was the strain. Historians still debate whether Egypt's monumental obsession helped unify the nation or sowed quiet bitterness. And monuments aged in curious ways. Sandstorms eroded their edges, floods gnawed at their bases, and in times of famine or invasion, desperate people dismantled stones to reuse in houses. Even the pyramids, symbols of eternity, became quarries for later builders. Eternity, it seems, sometimes came with an expiration date, yet somehow enough survived to astonish us. You walk in your mind through the hypostyle hall at Karnak, columns soaring like petrified trees, shafts of sunlight spilling through broken roofs. You trace your fingers across hieroglyphs, still crisp after millennia. You tilt your head back, and the stones seem to hum as if holding whispers of prayers carved into them. These were not just buildings, they were attempts to touch forever. And here's a thought that might make you smile. The workers who carved their names into hidden blocks never imagined tourists gawking at their graffiti thousands of years later. They weren't building for us. They were building for gods, for pharaohs, for their own pride. Yet somehow their sweat and laughter slipped through time, etched into stones that still speak. So as the chisels fade from your imagination, you realize the monuments weren't just about stone, they were about people. Their hands, their backs, their voices, all woven into architecture that dared to defy mortality. And even though dynasties crumbled and sands buried cities, the monuments stood stubborn against time, a reminder that Egypt dreamed bigger than most civilizations dared. And just as you marvel at that stubbornness, your thoughts drift to the ones who stood at the top of all this, the pharaohs, men and women who claimed the blood of gods and the weight of a nation. Their crowns weren't just ornaments. They were heavy with history. You feel the weight before you even see it, the sense of a presence so absolute that it doesn't need to shout. Pharaoh. In your mind, the word rolls like thunder over desert sand. The monuments, the temples, the armies, they were all tethered to a single figure whose crown wasn't just decoration, but the embodiment of Egypt itself. And tonight, as you walk further into this dreamlike past, you catch sight of the crowns themselves, gleaming in flickering torchlight, symbols as powerful as armies. The pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was Horus in human form, a god walking among mortals. That sounds impressive, but imagine the pressure of having to be divine before your morning bread and beer. The crowns made that divinity visible. Each one carried a message, and each one was heavy with meaning, literally heavy. The kind of headgear that could give you a stiff neck by lunchtime. First, there's the white crown of Upper Egypt, tall and sleek, shaped like a bowling pin perched proudly on the head. Then the red crown of Lower Egypt, wide and curved, with a little protruding spiral in front. When Egypt unified, the crowns merged into the double crown, a mashup of both that screamed, "Yes, I rule everything." Thank you very much. It wasn't subtle, but then again, politics rarely is. And here's a detail that makes historians chuckle. We don't actually know what these crowns were made of. No crown has ever been found intact. Were they woven from plant fibers, crafted from leather wrapped in gleaming metal? The materials vanished, but the images remain carved into stone, painted onto walls, and etched into amulets. Historians still debate whether the crowns were passed down physically, or if each ruler had new ones fashioned. The mystery lingers, adding a ghostly shimmer to the idea of royal regalia. The pharaoh's regalia didn't stop at crowns. You imagine him holding the crook and flail, the shepherd's staff and the whip, symbols of both care and authority. They looked elegant in art, but in practice tried juggling those in a desert breeze while balancing a 2-foot crown. Not exactly practical. But then being pharaoh wasn't about comfort. It was about image, the theater of power played out on a scale grander than any Broadway show, and of course the false beard. Even queens like Hatshepsut donned it to embody divine kingship. A long, narrow chin piece strapped on, turning every royal into a sort of cosmic Santa, minus the jolly laugh. Imagine giving orders while trying not to trip over your fake beard. It must have taken real commitment to stay regal. Pharaohs used crowns as much for politics as for religion. Picture a coronation, priests chanting, incense clouding the air, the new king seated on a gilded throne. The crown placed on his head wasn't just a hat, it was the binding of heaven and earth, the announcement that Ma'at, the divine order, would flow through him. Every subject watching felt the weight of that moment, a reassurance that the gods hadn't abandoned them. And here's a strange little fact. Crowns had personalities of their own in mythology. The red crown was said to hiss like a snake when enemies approached, warning the wearer of danger. Imagine having a hat that doubled as an early warning security system. Beats paying for medieval guard dogs. Pharaohs weren't immune to insecurity, though. Their crowns tied them to gods, but they also tied them to expectations. Fail to deliver prosperity and whispers would start. Was the crown rejecting him? Had the gods withdrawn their favor? You can almost feel the anxiety beneath the gold. It's like wearing a crown that doubles as a performance review. Except your boss is the cosmos, and sometimes queens claimed that same authority. Hatshepsut, ruling as king, wore the crown's beard and regalia, leaving no doubt she was pharaoh. Cleopatra later coiled her image into crowns thick with serpents, sending the message that she was both ruler and goddess. The regalia wasn't bound by gender, it was bound by power. And power in Egypt was as fluid as the Nile. The crowns also traveled into battle, though maybe not always on real heads. Reliefs show pharaohs striding into war with the blue crown, a rounded helmet-like piece dotted with golden studs. It looked practical, but let's be honest, it probably wasn't armor so much as theater. A ruler painted with that crown was already victorious before the first spear flew. The image itself was propaganda, carved into stone to declare, "The gods back me, so don't even try." As you stand in your mind's eye before a colossal statue of Ramses II, you see the double crown rising above his stone brow, eternal even as the real crown has crumbled to dust. You realize that the power wasn't in the material, it was in the belief. Crowns were contracts, agreements between people and gods, worn on human heads but pulsing with cosmic meaning. And here's the irony that makes you smirk. The crowns, for all their grandeur, weren't comfortable. Imagine the pharaoh stepping back into his private chamber, sighing, and setting the crown aside like someone kicking off tight shoes after a long day. The divine image slipped away, leaving just a man with a sore neck. Yet the moment the crown returned to his brow, the man vanished and the god-king appeared again. So, as you picture those crowns glowing in torchlight, you realize they weren't just headpieces, they were masks. Symbols, burdens, and blessings all in one. They tethered the pharaoh to eternity, even as they weighed on his very human shoulders. And as you linger on that thought, the scene begins to shift again. Because beyond crowns and thrones, what truly shaped Egypt wasn't just power at the top, but the river that pulsed through every field, every village, every life, the Nile itself. The crown slips from your mind and suddenly you hear water. Not just a trickle, not a polite stream, but a vast, endless rush that shapes the entire rhythm of life. The Nile. Even saying the word feels like a sigh, as though the land itself is breathing. Without it, Egypt would have been nothing but sand and scattered dreams. With it, they carved out a civilization that still whispers to us thousands of years later. You stand on the riverbank in your imagination, and the first thing you notice is how green everything is. On either side, fields stretch, lush and fertile. A carpet of life rolled out against the barren desert. Step just a little farther back, and suddenly the green stops dead. Beyond it, nothing but dunes and silence. The Nile isn't just a river. It's a line between existence and oblivion. You could say the Egyptians lived on the edge of a miracle, one annual flood away from collapse. The rhythm of life beat in time with the floods. When the river swelled each year, farmers rejoiced, well, mostly. It meant back-breaking labor, sure, but it also meant survival. The floodwaters left behind rich, dark silt, so fertile that crops leapt from the ground like kids rushing for free snacks. Barley, emmer wheat, flax, all of it sprang up, sustaining not just villages but temples, armies, and kingdoms. Without the Nile, there would have been no pyramids, no mummies, no pharaohs. Just dust. And here's a detail that makes you grin. The Egyptians didn't just measure time by seasons, they measured it by the Nile. They had 3 seasons: Akhet, flooding; Peret, growing; and Shemu, harvest. Forget spring, summer, fall, Egypt had Nile o'clock. Historians still debate how precise their flood predictions really were, but they got pretty good at reading the signs: the rise of certain stars, the behavior of birds, the way the wind shifted. It was like living with a cosmic calendar, written not in ink but in water. The river wasn't just practical, it was sacred. Egyptians believed it flowed directly from the tears of the goddess Isis, mourning her lost husband Osiris. The inundation itself was tied to the resurrection of Osiris, making each flood not just a natural event, but a divine promise. Death could be followed by renewal. Imagine hoeing your fields while believing you were part of a cosmic drama. Suddenly, farming doesn't seem quite so mundane. And of course, there were the hippos. Oh yes, those lovable, terrifying tanks of the Nile. They were sacred to some gods, feared by everyone else, and perfectly capable of wrecking a boat faster than you can say insurance claim. Hippos were dangerous enough that pharaohs had themselves depicted spearing them. Not just for sport, but as a symbol of conquering chaos. Picture a royal propaganda poster. Vote Pharaoh, he keeps the hippos in check. Honestly, not a bad campaign slogan. Boats were everywhere. The Nile was a highway, not just for trade, but for ideas, gossip, and power. From papyrus rafts to sleek wooden barges, vessels carried grain, beer, soldiers, statues of gods, even entire obelisks. The river stitched the country together like a blue thread through a patchwork quilt. Without it, Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt might have stayed separate worlds, glaring at each other across the sand. And here's a quirky fact. The Egyptians loved fishing, but they had rules. Certain fish were taboo in certain towns because of religious rivalries. In one city, eating a catfish might get you side-eye. In another, it might be seen as perfectly fine. Imagine explaining that at a medieval dinner party. No thanks. We don't do tilapia on Tuesdays. It offends the local crocodile god. Historians still debate whether these taboos were theological or just regional snobbery. But the Nile wasn't always gentle. Some years the flood didn't come high enough, leaving fields cracked and dry, famine creeping in like an uninvited guest. Other years it raged too high, sweeping away homes and livestock. The Egyptians lived in constant negotiation with their river, grateful yet wary, like roommates who loved each other, but occasionally threw wild parties that left everyone cleaning mud off the walls. Priests watched the river with anxious eyes. At Elephantine Island near Aswan, they kept a nilometer, a staircase carved into stone that measured the flood's height. Too low and fear spread. Too high and fear spread again. Just right and everyone exhaled. You can almost hear villagers whispering, "Please let the gods balance it this year." It was like a yearly exam with survival as the grade. The river's bounty spilled into every corner of Egyptian life. Papyrus reeds became boats, mats, sandals, even paper. The very word paper comes from papyrus. Fish and fowl fed families, mud bricks built homes, and the water itself. Life's eternal anchor. They drank it, bathed in it, and carried it in jars sealed with clay, as though bottling a fragment of divinity. And here's the poetic part. The Egyptians imagined the afterlife as another Nile Valley, perfect and unending, where fields grew green forever and boats glided smoothly under gentle breezes. To live by the Nile was to live in rehearsal for eternity. Each harvest was a promise that paradise could be real. You stand there in your mind, watching farmers bend over fields, children splashing in the shallows, a priest squinting at the nilometer, and boats drifting by with sails puffed like cheeks. The river murmurs like a lullaby, steady and endless, shaping not just the land but the very soul of Egypt. And just as you let that rhythm sink into you, the story flows onward, because if the Nile fed their stomachs, their gods fed their spirits. And the Egyptians had a pantheon as crowded and colorful as any festival parade. The Nile drifts behind you now, and suddenly the landscape brims with faces, too many to count, too many to ever fully understand. The gods of Egypt. You can feel them in every gust of wind, every grain of sand, every rustle of papyrus. It wasn't just one deity up there pulling strings. It was a whole ensemble cast, each with their own quirks, rivalries, and fan clubs. Honestly, it was less like one almighty figure, and more like a cosmic soap opera. Take Re, the sun god. He wasn't just the spotlight, he was the show. Egyptians imagined him sailing across the sky in a golden boat each day, then descending into the underworld at night to battle chaos itself. You picture the sun sinking not as, oh, time for sunset, but as a god grabbing his sword, sighing and thinking, here we go again. Historians still debate how literally people believed these myths, but the stories certainly gave rhythm and drama to each dawn and dusk. Then there was Osiris, lord of the dead and king of the afterlife. His skin was often painted green, the color of rebirth, like a walking metaphor for compost. He was beloved because he wasn't some aloof god floating far away. He had suffered, been murdered, chopped into pieces by his jealous brother Set, and resurrected thanks to the devotion of his wife Isis. If Ra was the daily clock, Osiris was the eternal promise. Death wasn't the end. Just a detour, and Isis, oh, she was the superstar. Mother, magician, healer, protector. People whispered her name in childbirth, in sickness, in grief. She wasn't just divine royalty. She was the comforter, the goddess who had endured loss and turned it into power. You can almost imagine ancient Egyptians scribbling her name into their equivalent of fan fiction, because Isis had a cult following so intense that it eventually spread into Greece and Rome. Honestly, she was more popular than most pharaohs. Horus, the falcon-headed god, was their symbol of kingship. His piercing eyes weren't just intimidating. They were the sky itself, one representing the sun, the other the moon. Each pharaoh was seen as Horus in the flesh, meaning politics and religion blended so tightly you couldn't tell where crown ended and wings began. Think of it as divine branding. Your king wasn't just a ruler. He was literally sponsored by heaven. But then came Set, god of chaos, storms, and general bad vibes. His animal form is still mysterious today, something between a donkey, a dog, and a creature invented during a particularly chaotic game of Pictionary. He represented the desert, the dangerous unknown, the sandstorms that made you cough for hours. To worship Set was to admit the world had sharp edges, but also to recognize that even chaos had a place in the grand design. Historians still argue whether Set was always a villain, or sometimes respected as a necessary force, which just proves he was complicated, like that friend you keep around even though they're always starting fights at dinner parties. And then there's Bastet, the cat goddess. Protector of homes, bringer of joy, destroyer of mice. Egyptians adored cats so much that harming one was basically signing your own death warrant. They believed Bastet guarded households, which is probably why cats strutted around villages like they owned the place, because technically they did. Imagine sneezing in front of one and apologizing, just in case you offended a goddess. The pantheon didn't stop there. Sobek, the crocodile god, lurked in the Nile's waters, promising both fertility and a reminder not to dip your toes in too casually. Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of love and music, made festivals swing with joy, like a divine DJ mixing love songs into the air. Thoth, ibis-headed and scholarly, kept track of wisdom, writing, and magic, scribbling down truths like the universe's eternal secretary. What's fascinating is how fluid these gods were. In one city, a god might be supreme. In another, they were barely mentioned. Deities merged, split, reinvented themselves. Ra became Amun-Ra. Isis merged with Hathor, Horus, and Set, fought endlessly, sometimes even sharing temples like divorced parents with joint custody of worshippers. To the Egyptians, religion wasn't static, it was alive, adaptable, constantly reshaped by politics, culture, and the tides of the Nile itself. And here's a quirky fact that might surprise you. Temples weren't always places for the public. Ordinary people often weren't allowed inside the inner sanctuaries. Instead, they worshipped in courtyards or at home with little clay figurines and simple offerings. Religion wasn't about attending Sunday service. It was woven into every action, from baking bread to burying a pet cat. The gods weren't distant. They were in the smoke of incense, the shimmer of the river, the whisper of wind through reeds. Festivals made the gods tangible. Imagine the statue of Amun paraded through Thebes on a golden bark, carried by priests, cheered by crowds. Offerings piled high, music blaring, dancers swaying, beer flowing like a river of joy. Religion wasn't all solemn prayers. It was also a community party, complete with feasting, laughter, and probably some bad hangovers. Historians still debate how much of these festivals were political versus spiritual, but for the people in the crowd, it hardly mattered. The god was there, right in front of them, and that was enough. What tied all this together was a concept the Egyptians called Ma'at, the balance, the cosmic order. Every god, every ritual, every law was meant to maintain it. Chaos wasn't just bad weather or political squabbles. It was a cosmic imbalance, a crack in the universe's harmony. Pharaohs claimed to rule for Ma'at, priests upheld it, and ordinary people prayed they could align with it. Without Ma'at, the Nile might stop, the sun might fail, the stars might fall. With it, life continued. You lean back in your mind, letting the chorus of gods swirl around you. Hawks and cats, crocodiles and cows, falcons and jackals. It's noisy, colorful, chaotic, and oddly reassuring. Because in their world, every fear, every hope, every question had a divine face, a story to hold on to. And in that constant dialogue between people and gods, the Egyptians built not just temples, but meaning itself. And just as you let the echoes fade, you realize something. Gods didn't just rule the heavens, they ruled the underworld too. And the Egyptian vision of life after death was a story even more intricate, even more haunting than the myths of gods themselves. The swirl of gods lingers around you, but now the story tilts downward, toward shadows, silence, and the endless question of what happens after the last breath. For the ancient Egyptians, death wasn't a cliff's edge, but a gateway, a cosmic border crossing, complete with paperwork, inspections, and some seriously strict customs officers. Honestly, you'd need more than just a passport. You'd need your heart in tip-top condition. Picture yourself lying in a dark chamber, the last flicker of oil lamps fading as mourners shuffle outside. Priests murmur prayers, sprinkling natron salt over your body to dry it out. It's not just hygiene. It's the first step in ensuring you're ready for eternity. The Egyptians took death so seriously that mummification became a whole industry, with specialists for every step, removing organs, treating skin, wrapping bandages. It was like a spa day, except with more hooks, resins, and way fewer cucumber eye masks. Historians still debate whether all classes of people got the same treatment or if it was mostly for elites. But even the poorest tried to preserve their dead somehow, because everyone hoped for eternity. But here's where the journey really begins. Once wrapped and sealed, your soul, your ka and ba, had work to do. Egyptians believed the soul wasn't one thing, but a collection of parts, each with its own needs. The ka, your life force, needed offerings of bread, beer, and incense. The ba, often shown as a bird with your head, could fly between the tomb and the world of the living, visiting family or checking in on offerings. You weren't gone completely. You were more like a regular house guest who popped in from beyond. Then came the treacherous journey through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. It wasn't a quick stroll. Imagine endless caverns, rivers of fire, serpents with knives for teeth, and gates guarded by monsters with names like He Who Lives on Entrails. This wasn't bedtime-friendly decor. It was a landscape meant to test the soul's courage and purity. Luckily, you weren't thrown in unprepared. The Book of the Dead, written on papyrus scrolls and tucked into tombs, gave you a cheat sheet of spells, passwords, and tips. Basically an ancient GPS for the afterlife. And here's the iconic scene, the weighing of the heart. In the Hall of Ma'at, your heart was placed on a golden scale, balanced against the feather of truth. If your heart was lighter than the feather, pure, free from lies and cruelty, you passed. If it was heavy, dragged down by sin, well, meet Amit. She was part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, and all nightmare. If she devoured your heart, you didn't get eternal torment. Worse, you got obliterated. Poof, no afterlife, no rebirth, just erased. Honestly, ancient Egyptians feared non-existence more than fire or torture. Standing beside the scales was Osiris, green-skinned and regal, watching with solemn eyes. Anubis, jackal-headed, handled the scale like the calmest lab technician ever, while Thoth, ibis-headed scribe of wisdom, recorded every outcome. You can almost hear the scratch of his pen as he writes, failed due to excessive gossiping at village markets. Historians still debate whether commoners believed this judgment literally or symbolically. But for Egyptians, it wasn't just a metaphor, it was hope. The universe was fair, justice would prevail, and everyone's deeds mattered. If you passed the test, paradise awaited, the field of reeds. Picture a perfected Egypt, lush fields, sparkling rivers, no weeds, no hunger. You'd farm again, yes, but without backbreaking labor. Crops grew abundantly. Cattle were always fat, and every day felt like the best harvest festival. You'd reunite with family, share feasts, and finally live without fear of famine or war. Imagine heaven as an endless, all-inclusive Nile resort, minus the mosquitoes. Here's a strange fact. Egyptians often buried little figurines called ushabti, tiny servants carved from wood or faience. The idea was that if Osiris called you to do work in the afterlife, like digging canals or sowing fields, the ushabti would spring to life and handle it. Think of them as magical interns, ensuring you could sip beer while your clay helpers did the chores. But not everyone imagined the same journey. Over centuries, belief shifted. Some thought the sun god Ra would carry your soul on his solar bark, letting you ride across the sky daily. Others imagined merging with Osiris, becoming one with his eternal cycle of death and rebirth. The afterlife was never a single story. It was a collage, constantly rewritten, just like life itself. And here's the kicker. The whole system wasn't just about death, it shaped life. Egyptians worked hard to live ethically, to honor Ma'at, because they believed every action would be tallied in that final weighing. Don't cheat your neighbor, don't insult the gods, don't hoard grain during famine, because somewhere, some cosmic accountant was jotting it down for your big day in court. You let the image settle, a chamber lit by torches, a golden scale gleaming, your heart trembling on one side, a feather floating effortlessly on the other. The gods watch in silence, their eyes steady, their judgment unflinching. You hold your breath, waiting for the scale to tip. And when it tilts toward justice, when you pass, the relief is so sweet, you can almost feel the reeds brushing against your legs, the sunlight warm and forgiving, the eternal Nile shimmering in the distance. And just as you settle into that paradise, the story tugs you forward. Because while Egyptians dreamed of eternity, they also obsessed over how to preserve their world in stone, through monuments, tombs, and carvings that still whisper their names thousands of years later. The reeds of eternity ripple softly behind you, but before the vision fades, you feel stone, cold, immovable stone, pressing into the story. Egyptians weren't content with living forever in memory alone. They carved eternity into the earth itself. Tombs, monuments, and inscriptions became their insurance policies against the erasure of time. And here's the part that will make you smile. These stone messages were basically the ancient version of "Don't forget me." Bro graffiti. Except 10 meters high and built to last millennia. You picture a desert horizon where the sun sinks behind jagged cliffs, painting the limestone in shades of saffron and rose. At your feet lies the Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs tucked themselves into the earth like secret seeds, each tomb an elaborate puzzle box designed to outwit both robbers and death itself. The walls shimmer with painted gods, protective spells, and star-strewn ceilings meant to guide the soul on its voyage. You run your fingers over the hieroglyphs, the grooves still sharp as if the chisels had been lifted yesterday. The silence is thick, but it hums with meaning, like the stone is whispering the names of those who once commanded nations. Of course, pyramids still loom in your imagination, those colossal triangles rising like mountains built by human hands. They were more than just tombs. They were cosmic architecture, each side aligned to the cardinal points, shafts angled to stars, the whole structure a kind of stairway for the pharaoh's soul to ascend to the heavens. You can almost hear ancient laborers chanting as they dragged blocks heavier than elephants across the desert. And here's the odd truth. For all their grandeur, pyramids eventually became too obvious, like leaving your valuables in a giant, glowing, steal-me box. Grave robbers couldn't resist. Historians still debate whether the shift to hidden cliff tombs was strategy, symbolism, or sheer frustration with ancient burglars. But not all monuments were for kings. Nobles and officials also carved their mark. Tombs in cliffs at Beni Hassan, mastabas with reliefs showing banquets, hunting, even goofy family pets. Imagine spending eternity showing off your favorite hunting dogs. Egyptians believed that carving an image or writing a name was a way of keeping it alive. So yes, those fish doodles and duck scenes, they weren't decoration. They were a promise that the afterlife menu included roast goose and fresh tilapia forever. And here's a quirky fact. Some tombs included false doors. They weren't for sneaky escape routes, but for the soul to pass through, coming and going to receive offerings. You can almost see a family kneeling before one, setting down bread and beer, murmuring prayers, while believing their ancestor was right there, slipping in through the invisible doorway to share the feast. Yet, for all the grandeur, Tombs were also vulnerable. Looting was rampant. Entire dynasties were stripped bare by thieves looking for gold, amulets, or fine linens. Sometimes even priests, the very guardians of the dead, joined in. Imagine the awkwardness of praying by day and plundering by torchlight at night. Egyptians hated this reality, and yet they couldn't stop it. So they layered their defenses, curses inscribed on walls, like "May a crocodile eat you," "May a serpent strike you," if you disturb this tomb. Still, as we know from countless cracked sarcophagi, curses weren't a foolproof lock. But perhaps the strangest twist is how much of this was about memory rather than treasure. Egyptians believed to speak the name of the dead is to make them live again. That's why cartouches, those oval name seals, appear everywhere, from grand pylons to humble amulets. You can almost hear a priest chanting the name of Ramses or Nefertari, keeping them alive one more day in the great cycle of remembrance. Historians still debate whether ordinary people felt their names had the same eternal weight. But judging by all the graffiti scratched by workers and travelers on monuments, everyone wanted a slice of immortality. Step now into Karnak or Luxor, temples sprawling with colonnades and inscriptions that stretch higher than modern billboards. Pharaohs boasted of victories, festivals, and gifts to the gods, chiseling their bragging rights into eternity. Honestly, it was like an arms race in stone, each ruler carving bigger, brighter, deeper, as if afraid their story might be erased by silence. And here's the sly bit. Some pharaohs literally erased their rivals. Chisels hacked away names of the unpopular, like Akhenaten, in a campaign of damnatio memoriae. The irony? The attempt to erase him only made him unforgettable today. And then there's the artistry. Imagine lying on your back in a painted tomb chamber, looking up at a ceiling of stars. Blue background, golden constellations marching across eternity. Even in death, Egyptians wanted to sleep under the cosmos, as if the tomb was not just a resting place but a second sky. You let your imagination wander down those corridors, past flickering torchlight, hearing the shuffle of ancient workers as they painted with ochre and lapis, their brushes delicate against fresh plaster. Every stroke was both art and magic, meant to last until the end of time. And somehow, against all odds, it worked. You're here thousands of years later, still listening to their whispers. And just as the dust settles in your mind's eye, another vision calls. Because monuments weren't only for the afterlife, they were also built for the living, for rituals that tied together the cycles of sun, Nile, and gods. And those rituals carried music, incense, and voices, rising in prayer beneath the columns of eternity. The stone halls fade behind you, and suddenly your feet are sinking into soft mud by the riverbank. The monuments may have been grand, but life in ancient Egypt pulsed in the humble rhythm of the peasants, the backbone of the whole civilization. Without their endless labor in fields, canals, and granaries, no pyramid, no tomb, no temple would have stood tall. And yet, their names are mostly lost to time, their voices silenced except for faint echoes scratched in ostraca or whispered in labor records. Tonight you get to walk among them. You feel the Nile breeze cool against your skin, carrying the scent of wet earth and reeds. It's dawn, and families rise with the first light, shaking off sleep on mats woven from palm fiber. Peasants live in small mud brick houses, rooms dark and stuffy, but decorated with clay pots, reed baskets, and maybe, if they're lucky, a single painted amulet hanging by the doorway. Children tumble out barefoot, already laughing despite the day's work ahead. You notice how their eyes linger on the river, because for them the Nile isn't just water, it's life itself, the difference between feast and famine. Work begins early. Men march into the fields, hoes slung over shoulders, their backs already sticky with sweat before the sun fully climbs. Women grind grain, the rhythmic scrape of stone on stone filling the air. You kneel beside them, watching hands worn smooth from years of this motion. The flour they produce will become bread, the staple of every meal, the true currency of survival. And here's a curious detail. Sometimes this bread was so coarse, full of sand from grinding stones, that it wore down people's teeth until their jaws ached. Imagine chewing your way into toothache every single day. Talk about dental misery before toothpaste was invented. Meals are simple: bread, beer, onions, maybe a little fish or lentils. You taste the earthy, slightly sour beer and think, this is less happy hour, more liquid oatmeal. But it kept people nourished, and in the blazing Egyptian sun, that mattered more than flavor. Meat was rare, a festival luxury. Honey, dates, and figs sweetened their lives when fortune allowed. And yet, despite the modesty of the diet, Egyptians were proud of their food culture, so much so that even in tomb paintings, peasants are shown plucking figs or pouring beer, as if the afterlife promised an eternal picnic. Daily chores are endless. Men repair canals, dredge mud, and build dikes to control the Nile's flood. Women weave linen on wooden looms, their fingers quick as birds darting through reeds. Children herd goats or chase geese, their laughter echoing across the village. Life isn't easy, but it's communal. You can feel the sense of shared survival, of neighbors helping neighbors. You imagine a festival day, music from flutes and drums echoing across the square, peasants dancing barefoot while priests bless the harvest. Even exhaustion can't stop joy from bubbling up when food is plentiful and the Nile has been kind. And here's a fact that might surprise you. Peasants could be drafted for massive state projects, working as part of a labor tax. One season you might be tilling your field. The next you're hauling limestone blocks for a pharaoh's tomb. Archaeologists at Deir el-Medina found records showing how workers were paid not just in bread and beer, but occasionally with extra onions as a bonus. Honestly, who knew onions were the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a raise? Historians still debate whether peasants saw this work as oppressive duty, patriotic service, or simply unavoidable fate. Probably a messy mix of all three. But daily life wasn't all labor. Families gathered at dusk, stories flowing with the night breeze. Parents told children about gods who shaped the Nile's floods, about animals with secret wisdom. You can picture a grandmother squatting by the fire, her voice low and raspy, telling how the sun god Ra sailed his boat across the sky, fighting off chaos every night. The children's eyes gleam with wonder, even if tomorrow they'll be back to chasing goats through dusty lanes. There was laughter too. Jokes scratched on shards of pottery reveal Egyptians had a sly sense of humor. One ostracon shows a sketch of a cat serving a mouse wine, a reversal of reality that still makes you grin thousands of years later. That's proof that even peasants, weighed down by endless work, found moments to laugh, to imagine, to play. Still, the vulnerability of their lives was stark. A bad flood too high or too low could wipe out crops. Disease lingered in stagnant waters, striking down children before their time. Families clung to amulets, prayers, and rituals for protection. You see a mother tying a little scarab charm around her son's neck, whispering hopes that the gods will guard him. These gestures feel so familiar, because across centuries, parents everywhere have made the same bargains with hope. And when death came, peasants rarely had the lavish burials of nobles. Often just shallow graves, a simple shroud, a few clay pots, and maybe, if love was strong and savings scraped together, a small figurine to keep them company in the afterlife. Yet even these humble burials carried the same belief that life didn't end here. In their simplicity, peasants carried eternity in their hearts as surely as any king entombed in gold. So, as you sit now by their hearth, listening to laughter mingle with the crackle of fire, you realize the essence of Egypt wasn't just in palaces or temples. It lived here in mud brick homes, in worn hands kneading dough, in children chasing geese under the setting sun. The monuments may have been built for kings, but the kingdom was carried on the shoulders of peasants. And in their everyday resilience, their humor, and their quiet faith, you catch the true heartbeat of ancient Egypt. And just as the firelight fades, you hear another sound, the steady rhythm of chisels striking stone. Because tomorrow's story isn't about fields or bread, but about art itself, the vibrant colors, statues, and carvings that made Egypt's soul visible for eternity. The rhythm of chisels echoes in your ears now, steady and sharp, a heartbeat carved into stone. You leave behind the fields of peasants and find yourself in a workshop, dusty, loud, and alive with creation. This is where Egypt's soul was made visible, through art and sculpture, a world of vibrant color, polished stone, and delicate lines that still stun us thousands of years later. The first thing that strikes you is the color. Forget the faded, sand-worn walls you see in museums today. Imagine walls exploding with indigo, saffron, teal, and russet, every figure outlined in fine black ink. Scenes of gods, pharaohs, and daily life march across plaster like comic strips of eternity. Artists painted fishermen casting nets, noble women adjusting jewelry, oxen plowing fields, all of it meant to freeze time so that what was painted could continue forever. You lean close to a wall and smell the faint mineral tang of powdered pigments, mixed with egg yolk and gum. A rainbow made from dirt. Alchemists of color turning the desert into stories. And here's the odd bit. Egyptian art wasn't about realism the way we think of it. Forget shading or perspective. Instead, it followed rules almost like a sacred grammar. Heads in profile, shoulders square, feet marching to the side. Everyone looks like they're ready to walk sideways out of the frame. You chuckle. It's the medieval emoji pack of its time. But there was purpose behind it. Clarity, order, eternity. Historians still debate whether artists truly saw the world this way, or whether they just stuck to conventions out of reverence and tradition. Either way, it worked. The style is instantly recognizable, unmistakably Egyptian. Statues tell another story. You wander between towering figures of pharaohs carved from granite. Their gaze is calm, their fists clenched on knees as if ruling even in stillness. The sheer scale makes you feel about the size of a cucumber, and honestly, you're half convinced these stone kings are judging your posture. Smaller statues, though, catch your eye. A scribe sits cross-legged, papyrus on his lap, eyes inlaid with quartz and copper that gleam like they're still wet with life. This isn't a king or a god. It's a real person honored for literacy, his gaze frozen mid-thought. You can almost hear him sigh, "Don't smudge the ink, kid." And here's something quirky. Some statues were deliberately left unfinished. Archaeologists have found blocks half-carved, chisels abandoned mid-strike, as if the sculptors clocked out and never came back. Maybe the patron died. Maybe the project got cancelled. Even pharaohs had budget cuts. So either way, it's a reminder that even in a culture obsessed with eternity, art was also just a job. Workshops were buzzing hives of labor. Apprentices crushed pigments, polished stone, or traced outlines. Masters guided steady hands, correcting angles with patience or sometimes not-so-patient mutters. You spot a boy covered in dust, muttering under his breath about how he should have been a fisherman instead. And then, in a blink, you see him grinning, proud as he finishes a lotus carving on a column. Even small touches mattered. Every brushstroke, every chisel mark was a prayer for permanence. But Egyptian art wasn't only grand. It could be playful too. Ostrich broken pottery shards were the sketch pads of the time. On them, artists doodled animals playing instruments, clumsy caricatures of nobles, or cats leading geese on leashes. It's proof that even in a society obsessed with cosmic order, people loved a good joke. Honestly, a doodle of a cat pouring beer for a mouse feels like the ancestor of memes. Historians still argue whether these were practice sketches, satire, or just bored artists having fun. Either way, they remind you that artists weren't just hands for hire. They had humor, personality, and maybe even sarcasm sharp as their chisels. And then there's the spiritual side. Art wasn't just decoration, it was magic. To paint a loaf of bread was to ensure bread existed for the soul in the afterlife. To carve a servant carrying jars was to guarantee eternal service. You realize that every image was a contract with eternity. That's why erasing a name or face was considered worse than death. It was like pulling the plug on someone's afterlife Wi-Fi. No name, no existence. The second death, they called it, and it terrified people more than the grave itself. Even music and dance slip into these painted worlds. Murals show musicians plucking harps, tapping lutes, beating drums while dancers whirl in linen skirts. You hear it faintly in your head, a rhythm echoing across centuries. Art gave sound and movement permanence, catching fleeting moments and pinning them forever against walls. The truth is, Egyptian art wasn't art in our modern sense. It was life insurance. Theology, propaganda, memory, and daily humor all at once. Kings used it to show power, priests to remind you of gods, families to hope for comfort in the afterlife, and workers to joke about the bosses. It was the Instagram, the billboard, the prayer book, and the diary, all painted in color and carved in stone. And as you step back, you realize this art isn't just frozen history. It still breathes. When you look into the eyes of that quartz-inlaid scribe, you feel him staring back. Thousands of years later, he's still here, still watching, still reminding you that Egypt's art wasn't meant to fade. It was meant to last forever, and somehow it did. Now let that chiseling fade into silence. Because next comes something equally human, but far more personal. The lives of women in ancient Egypt, who balanced power, family, and myth in ways that might surprise you. The river still murmurs behind you, but now your steps take you closer to the stone heart of Egypt. Its temples, You hear the hush of sandals on worn stone, the echo of prayers bouncing through cavernous halls, and the steady rhythm of incense smoke curling upward into shadows. Religion isn't just a part of life here, it is life. Every field, every flood, every grain of sand hums with the presence of gods. And you, just by being here, are swept into their orbit. You find yourself standing at the entrance of a massive temple. The pylons rise before you like cliffs, carved with hieroglyphs and scenes of kings smiting enemies. Painted in bright colors once, the walls now glow faintly in the sun, the figures frozen mid-swing, mid-prayer, mid-triumph. You can't help but tilt your head back, feeling very, very small. Which, of course, is the point. Temples weren't built for your comfort. They were built to remind you that the divine made the rules, and you were just a guest in their playground. Step inside, and the temperature drops. The world outside, the chatter of the market, the clatter of boats fades. Here it's all hush, echo, and shadow. Columns tower like forest trunks, their capitals carved as papyrus and lotus, flowers frozen in eternal bloom. Light sneaks in through high slits, dust swirling in golden beams. The air smells of resin and oil, a mix of sanctity and smoke. You walk slowly because here speed feels wrong, like running through a library. And then you see the priests. Shaven heads gleam in the dim light, linen robes crisp and white, sandals whispering against the stone floor. They move with a kind of quiet authority, carrying trays of offerings, bread, beer, flowers, meat. Every gesture is precise, rehearsed, like actors in a ritual drama that's been running for centuries. You realize they're not just serving the gods. They're keeping the whole cosmic order intact. No pressure, right? Forget missing a day of work. Miss a prayer here. And supposedly the sun might not rise. Here's a fun, slightly unnerving detail. Priests rotated duties, and when on shift, they followed strict purification rules. They shaved every bit of body hair, bathed multiple times daily, and wore only clean linen. Imagine explaining that to your boss today. Sorry, can't come in. Haven't shaved my legs in 12 hours. Might disrupt cosmic harmony. Honestly, the HR paperwork would be legendary. The rituals themselves are mesmerizing. A priest sprinkles water on the floor, sweeping away chaos with each flick. Another lights incense, the smoke spiraling upward like prayers made visible. Music drifts from the shadows, sistrums rattling, drums thudding softly. And at the center, in the innermost sanctuary, sits the statue of the god hidden from public eyes. Only priests and pharaohs may enter, and even then only with the right words, the right gestures, the right state of purity. To glimpse that statue was to stand face to face with divine power, and the weight of it pressed like stone on your chest. But temples weren't only spiritual. They were economic engines, storing grain, managing land, and controlling trade. Picture them less as quiet chapels and more as corporate headquarters, with priests doubling as accountants, scribes, and land managers. Some historians still debate whether the gods or the priests held more actual power. After all, if you controlled the temple's wealth, you controlled half the country's food supply. Holiness and bookkeeping, strange bedfellows but effective ones. And speaking of power, remember this. The pharaoh wasn't just a king. He was a living god. Horus on earth, son of Ra, mediator between divine and mortal. His presence in rituals wasn't symbolic. It was essential. If the pharaoh failed in his sacred duties, the crops might fail, the Nile might dry, and chaos might win. Talk about job pressure. Forget quarterly reports. You're literally responsible for the balance of the universe. No wonder they built pyramids the size of small mountains to prove they were up for the role. There's a softer side to all this, though. Ordinary people didn't just leave religion to priests and kings. They had their own household gods. Bez, the squat, cheerful protector with a lion's mane, or Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth. You'd find little clay figurines tucked in bedrooms, painted on walls or worn as amulets. If you couldn't afford to petition Amun or Osiris at the Grand Temple, you could still whisper a prayer to a chubby little lion-faced god while grinding grain. It's a reminder that even in a system designed to awe and overwhelm, people carved out their own corners of comfort. And then there's the weird side, the oracles. Imagine standing in a temple courtyard while priests carried a shrine on their shoulders, the god's image hidden inside. Questions were asked aloud and the shrine would sway yes or no. Was it divine will, stagecraft? Or maybe the priests just had a wicked sense of humor. Historians still debate whether these oracles represented real belief or political theater. Either way, you'd take that yes very seriously if it concerned your marriage, land, or lawsuit. The festivals tied it all together. Huge processions carried statues of gods down the Nile or through city streets with music, dancing, feasts, and drinking. For a few days, the barrier between sacred and everyday collapsed. You could sing and sway alongside priests, watch the god's image glide past in its gilded boat, and believe, even for a moment, that the divine was smiling directly at you. As you leave the temple, the heat of the sun hits you again, and the noise of daily life rushes back. You blink against the brightness, the image of incense smoke still ghosting your vision. The Nile glitters nearby, and in the distance workers labor in the fields, trusting that the gods, priests, and pharaohs will keep the balance. You can't help but wonder if faith was less about answers and more about rhythm, a structure to steady a world full of uncertainty. And as twilight stretches across the land, your thoughts drift to another constant rhythm, not prayers or floods this time, but the passing of life itself. Religion promised answers about the afterlife, but how did Egyptians prepare for that final journey? The story is about to step into tombs, mummies, and the strange, meticulous world of burial rites. The evening settles deeper now, the temple's echo fading behind you, and you realize that all the rituals, all the prayers, all the offerings, they were never just about today. They were about what came after. Because if there was one thing the ancient Egyptians obsessed over, more than keeping the Nile flowing or the sun rising, it was what happened when you stopped breathing. And spoiler, it wasn't just lying quietly under a rock. No, for them, death was less of an ending and more of a complicated travel itinerary, filled with divine customs checks and very strict packing requirements. You picture yourself walking through the necropolis outside the city. Rows of tombs stretch like stone suburbs, some small, modest little chapels, others sprawling complexes big enough to make a modern mansion jealous. The desert air feels dry, almost protective, as if it's guarding secrets buried deep beneath the sand. Each tomb is a promise, a waiting room for eternity, decorated not with grief but with hope, painted walls showing feasts, hunts, dances, as if to say, don't worry, life continues, just fancier. And then, of course, there's the mummification. So yes, the Egyptians took embalming seriously. You can almost smell the resin and natron salts in the air, sharp and acrid, filling a workshop where priests in jackal masks lean over a body. The organs are carefully removed, lungs, liver, stomach, intestines, each stored in canopic jars topped with protective deities. The heart, though, often stayed inside, because it was needed later in the afterlife. Meanwhile, the brain, tossed out through the nose with a hook. Imagine explaining that choice to your modern doctor. We kept the heart but ditched the brain, because feelings matter more than thoughts where you're going. Honestly, philosophers today might agree. It took about 70 days to prepare a mummy, with the body packed in salts to dry, then wrapped in layer after layer of linen. Between the layers, amulets were slipped in, scarabs, eyes of Horus, tiny charms meant to ward off trouble in the afterlife. It's like carrying travel insurance, but stitched directly into your bandages. Some historians still debate whether every detail was strictly ritual or partly experimental. After all, not every mummy survived perfectly. Some look eerily lifelike, others, let's just say they aged badly like leftover lasagna. But the wrappings were only the beginning. The tomb itself was the stage for eternity. Walls covered in vivid paintings showed harvests, banquets, fishing trips, and family scenes. Why? Because Egyptians believed what was painted could become real in the next life. Forget Instagram, this was ancient vision boarding on plaster. If you wanted an eternal picnic with geese and beer, you painted it. If you wanted servants to grind your grain forever, you hired an artist to paint them in neat little rows. And if you were rich enough, you commissioned Shabti figurines, tiny servants buried with you, ready to spring to life and do chores in your place. Honestly, that's the kind of afterlife hack we could all use. And here's where things get truly dramatic. The Book of the Dead. Not a single book, but a collection of spells, prayers, and instructions written on papyrus scrolls, tucked into the tomb or wrapped with the mummy. Think of it as a cosmic cheat sheet. Spells to open doors in the underworld, to ward off snakes, to breathe air when trapped in coffins. The most famous part? The weighing of the heart. Picture yourself standing before Osiris, ruler of the dead, your heart placed on a scale against the feather of Maat, goddess of truth. If your heart was lighter, congrats. You passed and entered paradise. If it was heavier, devoured by the monster Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippo, Talk about high stakes weighing in. Forget diet culture. This was literal soul balance. The afterlife itself, at least in popular imagination, wasn't some abstract cloudland. It was called the Field of Reeds, essentially a perfect version of Egypt. Green fields stretching forever, Nile waters glittering, crops abundant. No taxes, no hunger, no backbreaking labor, unless you forgot to bring your Shabti figurines. It was the ideal loop. You lived, you died, and then you lived again. But this time without the annoying bosses and floods arriving late. At least that was the dream. But not everyone got the deluxe package. Tombs varied wildly depending on wealth. Pharaohs and nobles had vast complexes with hidden chambers, false doors and traps for would-be robbers. Ordinary farmers, a simple pit, maybe a reed mat or a clay jar. Still, even the humblest graves often contained a token offering, bread, beer, or a small amulet. Because whether rich or poor, the idea was the same. Life continued, and you'd better pack something for the road. Of course, there's the irony we can't ignore: tomb raiding. Despite curses etched on walls, death will come on swift wings to him who disturbs this tomb. Most tombs were looted within decades, sometimes even by the same workers who built them. The Valley of the Kings, now famous, was once a hotbed of break-ins. Imagine spending years preparing your eternal home, only for some opportunist to sneak in, pocket your gold, and leave your mummy lying there in awkward silence. Some historians still debate whether Egyptians themselves quietly accepted tomb raiding as inevitable, or whether it truly shocked them each time. Either way, the gods of the afterlife must have sighed a lot. And then there's the weird, little-known details. Did you know some mummies had onions placed in their eye sockets, like sacred contact lenses? Or that miniature boats were buried with people so they could sail the celestial Nile? Archaeologists even found board games like Senet tucked into tombs, so the deceased wouldn't get bored waiting for judgment. Imagine eternity with nothing to do. Better have a board game handy, right? As you stand in this imaginary tomb, torchlight flickering on painted walls, the silence presses heavy, almost sacred. You can almost hear the whispers of prayers, the rustle of linen, the careful chant of priests sending someone on their way. For the Egyptians, death wasn't a full stop. It was a doorway. And they went through it prepared, bandaged, blessed, and equipped with enough spells to make Harry Potter jealous. And just as you leave this imagined necropolis, you realize the afterlife wasn't only about hope. It was also about power. Pharaohs used their tombs to project authority even after death, to remind future generations that their rule extended beyond the grave. Which means, to truly understand Egyptian life, you also need to understand Egyptian death. And so the story draws you deeper still, into the glittering world of pharaohs, pyramids, and the grand machinery of eternity itself. You leave behind the hush of tomb corridors and step into the blinding sun of Egypt's greatest symbols of eternity. The pyramids, those colossal stone puzzles rising from the desert, like mountains built by human hands. Even now you squint at them and feel that odd mix of awe and confusion. How did they do it? And more importantly, why did they think stacking 2.3 million blocks of limestone was the ultimate way to impress the gods? The answer, of course, wasn't just engineering. It was ideology. Pharaohs weren't just kings. They were believed to be divine, living embodiments of Horus on earth and destined to become Osiris in death, which meant their tombs couldn't be ordinary. They had to shout across eternity, "Here lies someone who ruled the Nile, commanded armies, and made the sun itself pause for a photo op." So pyramids became their stone loudspeakers. Picture yourself at Giza in its prime. The pyramids weren't dull, sandy hulks like today. They were dazzling white, covered in polished limestone casing stones that reflected sunlight so fiercely. They glowed like giant mirrors. At sunrise, they must have looked like crystal mountains. And at the very tip, a golden capstone, gleaming so bright you'd need medieval sunglasses to handle it. Some historians still debate whether the brilliance was meant to guide the pharaoh's soul skyward, or simply to remind peasants every morning who was in charge. Honestly, probably both. And let's not forget the workers. Forget the old myth of slaves collapsing under whips. Modern archaeology shows they were skilled laborers, organized into rotating crews. You can still see the remains of their village near Giza. Bakeries, breweries, dormitories. These workers ate better than many farmers, fueled by bread, beer, and onions. Not exactly a Michelin menu, but hey, it kept them moving giant blocks. And here's a quirky fact. Graffiti left behind by crews had team names like Friends of Khufu, and drunkards of Menkore. Imagine leaving, pyramid built by Team Beer Squad, scrawled inside one of the wonders of the world. Some things never change. Workers still love leaving their mark. The scale of these projects boggles your mind. The Great Pyramid of Khufu stood 146 meters tall originally, the tallest building on Earth for over 3,800 years. No steel, no cranes, just ramps, ropes, and sheer determination. Some theories suggest straight ramps, others spirals, still others internal passages. Historians debate endlessly, but the truth is no one knows for certain, which means every block you see still carries a whisper of mystery. And if you're wondering, yes, it probably did cause a few ancient back problems memes. Inside, the corridors weren't just stone tunnels. They were symbolic journeys, narrow passageways, hidden chambers, elaborate traps to deter tomb robbers. The king's chamber, lined with granite blocks hauled all the way from Aswan, was both a burial room and a cosmic stage, aligning with stars like Orion's belt. Pharaohs weren't just lying in coffins. They were plugged into the universe itself, aiming their souls toward eternity. It's the ultimate VIP afterlife package. No Wi-Fi, but plenty of starlight. The Sphinx, crouched nearby, adds another layer of riddle. With a lion's body and a human face, it stares across the sands like a cosmic bouncer, guarding the pyramids. Its nose may be missing, thanks to centuries of weathering and perhaps a bit of vandalism, but its gaze still feels unnervingly alive. Was it built as a guardian? A symbol of solar power? Or just a pharaoh saying, "Put my face on that cat, thanks"? Historians still argue, but the effect remains. It's part mystery, part monument, part meme before memes existed. Not all pyramids were flawless, though. The bent pyramid at Dashur is a perfect example. Its slope changes halfway up, like an architect suddenly panicked and said, "Oops, math's wrong, let's try plan B." Nearby, the red pyramid stands straighter, perhaps the corrected sequel. You can almost hear ancient construction supervisors debating angles like rival contractors on a reality show. Even pharaohs couldn't avoid a few design mishaps. And then came the Valley of the Kings. By the New Kingdom, pharaohs abandoned pyramids for hidden tombs carved into desert cliffs, hoping secrecy would protect their treasures. Spoiler, it didn't. Tomb robbers still found their way in, leaving most mummies stripped bare. The pyramids had shouted too loudly, and now rulers wanted whispers in the sand. Yet even there, the grandeur remained. Long corridors painted with vibrant scenes, ceilings dotted with stars, walls covered in the Book of the Dead. Death was still theater, just moved indoors. Here's the irony: despite all this effort, despite curses inscribed to terrify intruders, the only reason we know so much is because the tombs were disturbed. The pyramids loomed, the tombs were cracked open, and the treasures scattered. Yet somehow the idea worked. Pharaohs did achieve immortality, maybe not the way they imagined, but in the way their monuments still dominate skylines, inspire awe, and attract busloads of tourists with cameras. Honestly, that's a kind of eternity they probably didn't see coming. You stand at the base of Khufu's pyramid now, tilting your head back until your neck aches. The stones stretch upward, sun blazing overhead, shadows pooling at your feet. For a moment, you understand why Egyptians believed death wasn't an end, but a continuation. These pyramids don't just house pharaohs, they echo across time, reminding you that human ambition, whether in stone or spirit, always aims for the sky. And as the desert wind sighs around you, you know the story isn't finished yet. Because while pharaohs built for eternity, ordinary Egyptians lived more quietly, shaping history not with stone, but with daily life. And that perhaps is where the real heart of their story lies. You leave the pyramids behind, their shadows shrinking against the desert sky, and step into the quieter rhythms of ancient Egypt, the hum of daily life, where eternity wasn't carved in stone, but woven into ordinary moments. You hear the creak of wooden doors, the chatter of families at dusk, and the laughter of children chasing each other barefoot through courtyards. For all the grandeur of pharaohs, this is where most Egyptians truly lived. Not in temples, but in mud brick houses warmed by the sun. Step into one of those homes. The walls are simple, made from baked clay. The floors strewn with reed mats, and the air smells faintly of bread baking in clay ovens. A mother grinds grain on a stone quern, her arms moving rhythmically, while her daughter kneads dough nearby. In the corner, a boy sharpens a fishing hook, glancing out the door at the Nile shimmering in the distance. Life is fragile, yes, but also steady, patterned like the river's flood and retreat. Meals were humble: bread, onions, garlic, fish, and beer. Beer wasn't a luxury. It was daily sustenance, thick and nourishing, brewed in batches that bubbled away like a constant background melody. Children drank it, workers drank it, priests drank it. You could say Egyptians were basically fueled by carbs and craft brews, long before hipsters made it cool. Historians still debate just how boozy those beers were, but the fact remains: Egypt was a civilization built on bread and beer, and somehow it worked. Amid the chores there were joys. Music drifted through villages: flutes, harps, rattles, drums, played at feasts and festivals, or just in the evenings when neighbors gathered. Storytellers spun tales of gods, animals, and heroes, their words rising with the smoke of oil lamps. Children learned riddles and songs. Adults traded jokes about lazy officials or cranky bosses. Yes, workplace humor is older than papyrus. For a world so bound by gods and death, Egyptians actually cherished laughter, weaving light into their heavy truths. Clothing was simple but elegant. Linen robes, light and flowing, kept the heat at bay. Perfumed oils scented the air, both to mask sweat and to please the gods. Jewelry, even for common folk, gleamed with beads of faience and copper, tiny bursts of color against desert beige. And if you're imagining everyone walking around in pristine white robes, think again. Laundry was a constant battle, and clay dust had a way of winning. Education was limited, but scribes lived like rock stars of ink. To read and write was to hold power, to inscribe contracts, prayers, histories. You imagine a young apprentice bent over a wooden pallet, dipping his reed pen into ink, copying the same line over and over until his wrist ached. Writing is better than hard labor. And he was right. Better papyrus cuts than sunburns in the fields. Yet even this privilege was tied to duty. A scribe's pen wasn't just a tool, but a chain linking him to the bureaucracy that kept Egypt humming. Festivals broke the monotony, explosions of color, sound, and devotion. Streets filled with processions, statues of gods carried high, incense curling into the air. There were games, music, dances, even moments of excess when beer flowed like the Nile at flood. Ordinary Egyptians joined together in celebration, their prayers mixing with joy. Because in a land balanced between life and death, every feast was both thanksgiving and defiance. But death still lingered. Even the humblest families prepared amulets for protection, wrapped their dead carefully, and hoped for safe passage into the afterlife. Mummification wasn't reserved only for kings, though peasants couldn't afford golden coffins. They still clung to the belief that life continued beyond the tomb. Imagine a mother tucking a simple clay figurine beside her child's shroud, whispering that it would guide him on his journey. These weren't grand monuments, but tender gestures of love, as enduring as any pyramid. And here's the truth that often gets lost beneath stone monuments. The strength of Egypt wasn't just in pharaohs or gods, but in ordinary people who endured. Farmers coaxed crops from the soil. Boatmen ferried goods along the Nile. Artisans carved beauty into wood and stone. Mothers soothed fevers with herbs. Children grew up chasing dragonflies by the riverbank. Without them, there would have been no temples, no pyramids, no Egypt at all. Now as you stand at the edge of this story, the desert quiet around you, your breath slows. You've walked through centuries, through temples and tombs, through famine and feast, through gods and ghosts. You've watched pharaohs rise and fall, pyramids gleam and crumble, legends flicker and fade. And yet, through it all, life persisted, humble, stubborn, radiant in its own way. So let the images soften. The pyramids blur into pale silhouettes. The Nile, once rushing with voices and boats, settles into a hushed silver ribbon. The chatter of marketplaces fades, replaced by the whisper of wind over reeds. And in that hush you feel the heartbeat of history not as noise, but as a gentle lull. Your eyelids grow heavy now. The stories, once sharp and vivid, stretch into softer lines like ink running in water. You're safe, here in the present, far from the fears and toils of the ancients. Let their voices sink into silence, leaving you only with the warmth of knowing that even in ages of dust and stone, people still laughed, still loved, still dreamed, breathed deep. Let the weight of centuries dissolve like sand, slipping through your fingers. Drift into stillness, into the quiet night, into the embrace of sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.